Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The water stain on my bedroom ceiling had always been there, a yellowed bloom spreading from some ancient leak in the apartment above. I'd lived beneath it for 3 years without giving it much thought. But that night, lying awake at 3:47 a.m., I saw the face for the first time. Not a face exactly, the suggestion of one. 2 darker spots where eyes might be, a curved line that could have been a mouth twisted in something between agony and rage. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes until phosphones danced across my vision, looked again. Still there. The longer I stared, the more defined it became, as if my attention were developing it like a photograph in chemical solution. I told myself it was nothing. Pattern recognition, the human brain's desperate need to find meaning in chaos. We see faces in clouds, in toast, in the random distribution of minerals in rock formations. It's evolutionary biology, not supernatural visitation. The part of our brain that helped our ancestors spot predators in tall grass now conjures phantom observers from textured ceilings and wood grain. The rational explanation didn't help me sleep. The next morning, the face was gone. Or rather, it had never truly been there. Just a stain, irregular and meaningless in the gray light filtering through my blinds. I felt foolish standing on my bed to examine it closely, tracing the discoloration with my finger. Water damage. Nothing more. I made coffee, went to work, tried to forget the unease that had settled into my chest like cold sediment. But that night, there it was again. Clearer now, as if my first viewing had etched neural pathways that made subsequent recognition inevitable. The eyes, those 2 darker spots, seemed to track my movement as I crossed the room. I knew this was impossible. I understood the mechanics of pareidolia, had read about it in college psychology courses. The image wasn't moving. My perspective was changing, creating an illusion of tracking. Yet understanding didn't diminish the crawling sensation at the base of my skull. I began sleeping with the lights on. This should have solved the problem. Pareidolia thrives in ambiguity, in low light where the brain must fill gaps with assumption and pattern. Proper illumination would eliminate the shadows, the contrasts that created the illusion. Instead, the brightness seemed to sharpen the features, lending them a 3-dimensional quality I couldn't explain. The face wasn't just appearing in the stain. It seemed to be pressing through it, as if the ceiling were a membrane separating me from something patient and watchful. I stopped sleeping. Not entirely. The human body won't allow such defiance. But sleep became something that ambushed me in brief, unsatisfying intervals. I'd jolt awake with my heart hammering, certain that in the moment of unconsciousness the face had moved, had advanced some imperceptible distance closer. My logical mind knew this was exhaustion talking, knew that sleep deprivation causes hallucinations, paranoia, distorted perception. But the primitive part of my brain, the part responsible for survival, insisted that vigilance was required. The face began appearing elsewhere. At first, I dismissed these new sightings as products of sleep deprivation. Everyone knows that exhaustion warps perception, that the mind becomes unmoored without proper rest. In the bathroom mirror, steam from the shower would condense in patterns that formed the same anguished expression. In the living room, the grain of the wooden floor would align into familiar eyes, watching me from beneath the couch. The wallpaper in the hallway, a pattern I'd never particularly noticed, suddenly revealed face after face, dozens of them, a crowd of witnesses to my unraveling. I understood what was happening. Priming effect, they call it. Once your brain learns to recognize a specific pattern, it begins finding that pattern everywhere, even where it doesn't exist. I'd trained myself to see this particular configuration of features, and now my overactive pattern recognition system was running wild, manufacturing observers from randomness. This explanation satisfied my rational mind, but did nothing to stop the phenomenon. I began documenting the faces with my phone, thinking that photographic evidence would prove them non-existent, or at least show them as obviously meaningless artifacts of texture and shadow. But the camera saw them too. Not as clearly as I did. The images were ambiguous, requiring study to perceive the features. But they were there. I showed the photos to a colleague, asking casually what he saw in the patterns. He shrugged, said he could kind of see a face if he squinted, the way you can see shapes in clouds. His indifference should have reassured me. Instead, it isolated me further. The faces were changing, subtle shifts, night by night, the mouth curving deeper into something more pronounced, more deliberate. The eyes, those persistent spots of darker pigmentation or shadow or whatever they were, seeming to widen, to focus with increasing intensity. I knew this was impossible. Water stains don't evolve. Wood grain remains constant. The logical explanation was that my perception was changing, my exhaustion-addled brain finding increasingly elaborate patterns in static stimuli. But logic had begun to feel like a flimsy shelter against a rising tide. I researched pareidolia obsessively, reading scientific papers at 4 a.m. while the face on my ceiling watched. The studies confirmed what I already knew. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures, our brains wired to detect faces above all else. Face recognition is processed by a specialized region of the brain, activated even by the suggestion of facial features. This hyperactive face detection likely evolved as a survival mechanism. Better to see a face that isn't there than to miss a predator or adversary. The research also described how stress, isolation, and sleep deprivation intensify the phenomenon. How sensory deprivation can trigger hallucinations. How belief in the supernatural can prime the brain to interpret ambiguous stimuli as paranormal. I fit every criteria for someone susceptible to false pattern recognition. This should have been comforting. It wasn't. Because the faces had begun appearing during the day, not just in low light or ambiguous conditions, but in bright afternoon sun streaming through my windows. In the concrete wall of the parking garage at work, I'd see them arranged in grids, like a gallery of the accused. In the ceiling tiles of the office, in the random distribution of speckles on the linoleum, in the reflection of fluorescent lights on my computer monitor. Always the same basic configuration, those eyes, that mouth, but multiplied, reproduced, as if whatever I'd initially perceived had learned to propagate itself through any surface textured enough to accommodate it. My productivity suffered. I found myself staring at walls during meetings, trying to determine if the faces were really there, or if I was losing my grip on reality. Colleagues asked if I was feeling well. I claimed allergies, insomnia, stress. All true, in their way, though the underlying cause remained unspoken. How do you explain that you're being watched by patterns? That your brain's tendency toward pareidolia has become so aggressive that you can no longer look at any irregular surface without seeing observers? I consulted a doctor, carefully omitting the full extent of my experiences. I described the insomnia, the stress, the difficulty concentrating. She prescribed sleeping pills and suggested therapy for anxiety. The medication helped me sleep but didn't stop the dreams. Or were they dreams? In that twilight state between waking and unconsciousness, I'd feel the weight of observation pressing down like physical force, would sense the faces not just watching, but communicating something urgent and terrible that I couldn't quite decipher. The pattern recognition had become prediction. I'd walk into a room and know, before my eyes adjusted, exactly where the faces would appear, as if my brain were no longer discovering them, but remembering them, as if they'd always been there and I'd simply failed to notice. This, too, had a rational explanation. Memory and expectation shaping perception, the brain creating what it anticipated rather than objectively recording what existed. But the faces were no longer confined to static surfaces. I'd see them in crowds. Just for a moment, a pedestrian's features would align into that same expression before resolving into something normal, unremarkable. I'd see them in the mirror, not in the glass itself, but hovering behind my reflection, present in the bathroom's negative space. I'd see them in the dark behind my eyelids, phosphorescent afterimages that glowed with their own sourceless light. I stopped leaving my apartment except when absolutely necessary. This was a mistake. Isolation amplifies every psychological tendency toward instability, every minor perceptual quirk. Without external reference points, without normal social interaction to anchor me in consensus reality, I became unmoored, adrift in a world where every surface was a potential host for the watching faces. I tried to rationalize the progression. Sleep deprivation causes hallucinations. Fact. Stress intensifies pattern recognition. Fact. Isolation leads to paranoia. Fact. I was experiencing a cascading system failure, each symptom feeding into the next, creating a feedback loop of deteriorating perception. None of this was supernatural. It was psychology, neurology, the predictable breakdown of an overstressed nervous system. Yet when I covered the ceiling stain with tape and paint, when I covered every surface that might harbor a face, the watchers simply migrated. They appeared in the texture of the paint itself, in the pattern of the tape, in the very materials I'd used to obscure them, as if they weren't residing in the surfaces but in my perception of them, in the fundamental process by which I translated optical input into meaning. I contacted a friend, someone I'd been avoiding in my isolation, and tried to explain. They listened with growing concern, then gently suggested I needed professional help, that what I was describing sounded like the onset of something serious. They used words like episode and break and psychiatric evaluation. I heard the fear in their voice, the careful modulation of tone that people use when they think you might be dangerous or fragile. The conversation ended with promises I didn't keep, appointments I wouldn't make, because I'd realized something that made professional intervention seem irrelevant. The faces weren't appearing randomly. There was a pattern to their pattern, a structure to their emergence. They appeared most prominently at 3:47 a.m., the time I'd first noticed the ceiling stain. They intensified when I was alone, when I was stressed, when I doubted my perception. They receded, became ambiguous again, when I had witnesses, when I tried to document them objectively. This suggested something my rational mind struggled to accept, that they were somehow aware of being observed, aware of observation itself, or, and this was more terrifying, that I was no longer able to distinguish between their behavior and my perception of it, that the boundary between observer and observed had become fatally blurred. I began conducting experiments, crude attempts at scientific method applied to subjective experience. I'd stare at neutral surfaces, blank walls, clean paper, and wait to see if the faces emerged. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. The inconsistency proved nothing except that my perception was unreliable, which I already knew. What troubled me was the evolution. The original face on my ceiling had been static, an unchanging pattern, but over weeks of observation, it had developed details. Shadows beneath the eyes suggesting exhaustion or illness, fine lines around the mouth implying either age or perpetual tension. These details were impossible. Water stains don't acquire definition through observation. Yet the changes were documented in my photographs, subtle progressions visible when I compared images chronologically. Unless the changes were in my perception, my brain adding details with each viewing, building a more complete representation from incomplete data. The way memory works, not recording reality but constructing it, each recall slightly altering the stored information. I couldn't tell anymore which explanation was more disturbing, that something was actually changing, or that my mind was so thoroughly corrupted that I could no longer trust even photographic evidence. The turning point came 3 months after that first sleepless night. I woke, or thought I woke, at 3:47 a.m. to find my bedroom transformed. Every surface bore the face. Ceiling, walls, floor, the back of my door, the screen of my phone. Not textured approximations, but clear, detailed renderings, as if whatever force had been expressing itself through random patterns had grown strong enough to manifest directly. I lay frozen, understanding that this was either a nightmare or a psychotic break, that no reality I believed in could accommodate what I was seeing. Yet the experience had the granular texture of waking consciousness, the physical discomfort of my twisted sheets, the taste in my mouth, the sound of my neighbor's TV through the wall. The faces began to speak. Not with voices, nothing so crude, but with a communication that bypassed language entirely. meaning transmitted directly into my consciousness. They told me that I'd been correct all along, that pareidolia was the mechanism but not the explanation, that human brains evolved to detect faces because faces were there to detect, had always been there, watching from the gaps between definite and indefinite, sustained by the very act of perception that revealed them. They told me I'd seen too much, recognized too completely, and in doing so had thinned the membrane between observer and observed, that I was becoming like them, pattern without substance, meaning without form, forever watching, forever waiting for someone to recognize the next configuration. When I jolted truly awake, or to another level of waking, the faces were gone, just surfaces again, ordinary and meaningless. I sat up, checked my phone. 4:23 a.m. The entire experience had consumed 36 minutes of subjective time. A nightmare, obviously, sleep deprivation, hallucination, the expected culmination of months of stress and insomnia. I should have felt relief at this explanation. But when I looked up at the ceiling, the water stain was gone, not painted over, not covered, simply absent, the ceiling smooth and unmarked as if it had never been damaged at all. I grabbed my phone, opened my photo gallery, scrolled through months of documented faces. The images were blank. Walls, ceilings, floors, all smooth and featureless, no patterns visible whatsoever. As if the faces had never been there, or as if I'd never really been photographing anything but my own deteriorating perception. I sit now at my desk as dawn breaks, writing this account while I can still remember it clearly, before time and doubt erode the details. The rational explanation remains available. I suffered a psychological episode triggered by stress and isolation, projected meaning onto randomness until the projection consumed me, then recovered when the cycle broke. Everything I experienced can be explained by neurology and psychology. Nothing supernatural occurred, yet I can't stop noticing the wood grain on my desk, the way shadows fall across the wall, the texture of the paper under my hand. Because now I understand that seeing faces in patterns isn't a trick of perception. It's perception working exactly as designed. The faces are always there, embedded in the random distribution of matter, waiting for the right observer to give them definition. And I wonder, in these quiet morning hours, whether I stopped seeing them because they're gone, or because I've finally learned to stop looking. Whether recovery means returning to blindness, unseeing what can't be unseen. Outside my window, the sun rises over buildings whose facades are composed of countless windows, their arrangement random, yet oddly regular. If I let my focus soften, if I stop fighting the pattern recognition that evolution installed in my brain, I can see them all looking back at me, thousands of watching faces in the architecture of the city, in the clouds above, in every irregular surface that catches the growing light. The question I can't answer, the question that will haunt every moment of whatever normal life I pretend to rebuild, is whether I'm creating these observers through the act of perception, or finally seeing what's always been there, patient and eternal, waiting for someone to recognize them fully enough to join their watching. I think I'm going to stop writing now. Going to close my eyes and try to unknow what I've learned, to retrain my brain to ignore the patterns, to see randomness as truly random, rather than as a substrate for something older and stranger than I can comprehend. But even with my eyes closed, I can feel them watching through the darkness behind my eyelids, those persistent patterns, that fundamental face my brain evolved specifically to detect. And I understand, with a clarity that transcends rationality, that whether they're real or imagined no longer matters, because I can't stop seeing them, and they can't stop seeing me. Story 2. The apartment smelled like old paint and something else, something organic that had been sealed behind the walls for too long. I stood in the empty living room, my footsteps echoing against bare floorboards, and told myself this was a fresh start. The lease was signed. The boxes were coming tomorrow. There was no turning back now. That first night, I slept on an air mattress in the bedroom, surrounded by the few bags I'd brought with me. The building was old, one of those converted warehouses in the industrial district that developers love to rebrand as historic lofts. Through the tall windows, Sodium lights from the street below cast orange shadows across the ceiling. I watched them shift and sway, listening to the ambient hum of the city, distant traffic, the occasional siren, the low rumble of something mechanical that seemed to pulse through the floor itself. I woke at 3:47 a.m. with my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was the same. The shadows hadn't moved. Nothing had changed, yet every cell in my body screamed that something was wrong. I sat up slowly, scanning the darkness, my breath shallow and rapid. The sensation was primal, the kind of fear that bypassed rational thought entirely. Something was watching me. I was certain of it. But the apartment was empty, locked from the inside, and the windows faced a brick wall 20 feet away. I forced myself to lie back down, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin like a child. My hands were trembling. The logical part of my mind insisted this was just first-night jitters, the stress of the move, the strangeness of sleeping in an unfamiliar place. But my body refused to listen. My skin crawled with invisible insects. The hair on my arms stood rigid, and beneath it all, so faint I almost didn't notice it, was a sensation like standing too close to a massive speaker, a pressure against my chest, a vibration I felt rather than heard. Sleep didn't come back that night. Over the following days, I tried to settle in. The moving company delivered my furniture. I unpacked boxes, hung pictures, arranged books on shelves. The apartment began to look like mine, yet it never quite felt that way. There was always something slightly off, a subtle wrongness I couldn't articulate. Friends who visited would comment on how great the space was, how lucky I was to find such a deal, but I noticed they never stayed long. They'd shift uncomfortably after 20 minutes, make excuses about traffic or early mornings, and leave with a quickness that felt almost like escape. I started having trouble sleeping. Not insomnia, exactly. I could fall asleep easily enough. But I'd wake repeatedly throughout the night with that same primal terror clutching at my throat. Sometimes I'd wake to find myself standing in the hallway, my hand on the doorknob, with no memory of getting out of bed. Other times I'd jerk awake convinced someone had whispered my name, only to find myself alone in the silence. The headaches started in the second week. They weren't severe, just a persistent pressure behind my eyes, a dull ache that painkillers couldn't quite touch. I went to the doctor, thinking maybe it was stress or eye strain from staring at screens all day. She found nothing wrong, suggested I drink more water, get more sleep. I didn't tell her about the other symptoms, the persistent nausea, the way my hands sometimes shook for no reason, the growing sense that my apartment was somehow hostile to my presence. It was Dimitri from upstairs who first mentioned the ventilation system. We'd met in the hallway one evening, both of us collecting mail from the metal boxes mounted to the wall. He was a quiet man in his 50s, someone who'd lived in the building since before the renovation. When I mentioned I was having trouble adjusting to the new place, he gave me a knowing look. The building's climate control system ran constantly, he explained, maintaining temperature and airflow throughout the structure. It was an old industrial setup, retrofitted for residential use, and sometimes it could be a bit much. He'd gotten used to it over the years, he said, but new tenants often complained about feeling uneasy during their first few months. Something about the way the air moved through the old ducts, something about how the machinery hummed through the building's bones. That night I lay in bed and tried to focus on the sounds around me, the refrigerator's compressor cycling on and off, the occasional groan of pipes behind the walls. And yes, there it was, a low, steady thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was so deep it was almost subsonic, felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. Once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. It was always there, day and night, a constant pressure against my consciousness. I started researching online late at night, falling down rabbit holes of forum posts and scientific articles. I learned about infrasound, frequencies below the threshold of human hearing, typically under 20 hertz. I discovered that certain frequencies could cause feelings of unease, anxiety, even visual hallucinations. That exposure to infrasound had been linked to reports of hauntings and paranormal experiences, that it could make people feel like they were being watched. create a sense of presence in empty rooms, cause panic attacks and disorientation. The ventilation system, the old machinery, the constant subsonic hum that pervaded every corner of the building. It all made sense. Except it didn't, because knowing the cause didn't stop the effects. The headaches continued, the night terrors intensified, and new symptoms began to emerge. Visual distortions at the edges of my perception, shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source, a growing certainty that I was not alone in my apartment, even when I knew, rationally, that I was. One morning, I woke to find muddy footprints leading from my bedroom door to the window. They were my boots, I realized, the ones I kept by the front door, but I had no memory of putting them on, no memory of walking across my own bedroom floor. The prints were fresh, the mud still damp. I stood there for 10 minutes, staring at them, trying to construct a narrative that made sense. Sleepwalking. It had to be sleepwalking. Except the mud suggested I'd been outside, and I was still in my pajamas, and the door was locked from the inside with the chain engaged. I called the building management about the ventilation system. A technician came out the next day, a man who spent 20 minutes checking vents and consulted a clipboard with maintenance records. Everything was functioning normally, he assured me. The system was actually quite sophisticated, designed to be as quiet and unobtrusive as possible. If I was experiencing discomfort, perhaps I should try a white noise machine to help me sleep. Perhaps I should open the windows more often for fresh air. But opening the windows didn't help. The sensation followed me everywhere in the apartment. That pressure in my chest, that crawling certainty of being observed. I began to notice patterns. The symptoms were worst in the bedroom and the living room, less severe in the bathroom and kitchen. I started spending more time near the edges of the apartment, instinctively avoiding the center of each room. Work became impossible. I'd sit at my desk, laptop open, and find myself staring at the wall instead, watching for movement that never quite materialized. My boss called after I missed 2 meetings. Was everything okay? I sounded stressed. Maybe I should take some time off, get some rest. I agreed, though I knew rest wouldn't come. Not here. Not in this place that seemed to hum with malevolent intent. I tried staying with friends, testing whether distance would help, and it did. Sleeping on a couch across town, I felt normal for the first time in weeks. The headaches faded. The nausea subsided. I slept through the night without waking in terror. But I couldn't impose forever, and eventually, I had to return to my lease, my belongings, my life. The apartment felt different when I came back. Hostile. The air itself seemed thick, resistant, as if the space resented my absence and was now punishing my return. I stood in the doorway, bags in hand, and almost turned around. Almost called my landlord to break the lease, consequences be damned. But pride, or stubbornness, or simple financial necessity kept me rooted in place. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. That night was the worst yet. I woke, or thought I woke, to find my bedroom filled with movement. Shadows rippled across the walls like living things, flowing from corner to corner in patterns that hurt to follow. The pressure in my chest had become a weight, crushing down, making each breath a labor. And there, in the corner where the darkness gathered thickest, I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, its outline sharp against the lesser darkness around it. It didn't move. It simply stood there, watching with eyes I couldn't see but could feel boring into me. I tried to scream. Nothing emerged but a thin wheeze. I tried to move. My body wouldn't respond. Paralysis gripped me, total and terrifying, while the figure in the corner began to lean forward, its proportions all wrong, its presence so alien that my mind rejected what my eyes were showing me. The pressure intensified until I thought my ribs would crack. The room spun, and then, mercifully, I passed out. Morning came. I was in bed, covers twisted around me, my pajamas soaked with sweat. The corner was empty. The walls were still. Everything looked normal in the gray light of dawn. A nightmare, I told myself. Sleep paralysis brought on by stress and whatever low-frequency vibrations were rattling through the building's infrastructure. A hallucination induced by infrasound. Nothing more. But I could still feel where its gaze had landed. I contacted a different technician, not through the building, but an independent HVAC specialist I found online. I explained my symptoms, my research into infrasound, my suspicion that something in the ventilation system was affecting me. He arrived with specialized equipment, tools I didn't recognize, meters that measured things invisible to the naked eye. He spent 3 hours examining every vent, every duct, every connection point in the system. His findings were unexpected. Yes, there was infrasound present, but it wasn't coming from the ventilation system. The frequency was too irregular, the source too diffuse. It seemed to be emanating from the walls themselves, from the very structure of the building. He'd seen something similar once before, he said, in an old factory that had been built on reclaimed marshland. The ground beneath had been unstable, settling unevenly, causing the building to flex and resonate at frequencies that affected everyone inside. His suggestion was to break the lease, find somewhere else to live. Some buildings, he said carefully, just weren't meant for people, but I had nowhere else to go. The lease was ironclad. My savings were depleted. And besides, some stubborn part of me refused to be driven out by something as mundane as architectural acoustics. I was a rational man. I understood what was happening. Understanding should bring control. It didn't. The hallucinations, for that's what I forced myself to call them, intensified. I saw things moving in my peripheral vision constantly now, heard whispers in the static hum of the building, felt hands brushing against my skin when I knew I was alone. I stopped inviting people over because their reactions frightened me more than my own experiences. They'd stop mid-sentence, their eyes tracking something across the room I couldn't see. They'd ask if I heard that, felt that, saw that. And when I asked what they meant, they'd shake their heads, suddenly eager to leave, making excuses that felt like abandonments. I began documenting everything, notes on my phone, entries in a journal, photos and videos that showed nothing but empty rooms yet felt heavy with presence. I was building evidence, I told myself. Proof of what was happening. But proof for whom? For what purpose? The technician had confirmed the infrasound. The cause was established. Yet knowing why I was experiencing these symptoms didn't make them stop, didn't make the apartment feel less hostile, didn't explain the footprints, or the moved furniture, or the mornings I woke with bruises I couldn't account for. Dmitri found me in the hallway one evening, sitting against the wall, unable to force myself to unlock my apartment door. He sat beside me without asking questions, just keeping me company in the fluorescent silence. Eventually he spoke about his first year in the building, the things he'd seen, the feelings that had almost driven him away. He'd learned to cope, he said, learned to tune it out. The human mind was remarkably adaptable. Given enough time, even the impossible became routine. But his eyes when he said this were hollow, and I wondered what it had cost him to adapt. What parts of himself he'd had to suppress or deny to continue living here. And I wondered if I wanted to pay that same price. Tonight I'm sitting on my bed, laptop balanced on my knees, writing this down, because I need to record it somewhere. Need to leave some account of what's happening before I can't trust my own perceptions anymore. The pressure in my chest is constant now. The shadows are moving again, flowing across the walls in patterns that seem almost purposeful. And in the corner, always in that same corner, something is gathering. Something tall and thin and patient. The rational part of my mind insists it's the infrasound. Low-frequency vibrations affecting my inner ear, my visual cortex, my limbic system, creating sensations of presence, manufacturing threats where none exist, my brain inventing monsters to explain the unexplainable discomfort of subsonic pressure. But what if that's not the full story? What if infrasound doesn't create these sensations? What if it just makes us sensitive to things that are already there? What if those frequencies don't manufacture presence but merely strip away the filters that normally keep us from perceiving what shares our spaces? The figure in the corner is leaning forward now. I can feel its attention like a physical weight, and I know, with a certainty that transcends rational thought, that it's been here all along. In this corner, in this building, waiting for someone whose perception had been adjusted, whose defenses had been worn down by weeks of subsonic assault until they could finally see what had always been watching. My hands are shaking as I type this. The pressure in my chest is crushing, and I'm starting to wonder if the worst part isn't the horror itself, but the question that follows. If infrasound can make us hallucinate threats that aren't there, can it also prevent us from seeing threats that are? The figure is moving now. I should close the laptop. I should run. But I can't tell anymore if the paralysis is from fear or from something in the frequencies that pervade this place. Can't tell if what I'm seeing is real or manufactured. Can't tell if I'm documenting reality or my own descent into manufactured madness. And in the end, I'm not sure the distinction matters. The terror is the same either way. The shadow reaches forward with something that might be a hand. I can't look away. Story 3. The fluorescent lights of the gas station hummed with that particular frequency that settles behind your eyeballs and stays there. 2 a.m, somewhere in South Dakota where the interstate stretched like a black ribbon through nothing. And I was the only customer at the last pump before the highway split east toward Minnesota or west toward Wyoming. The kind of place that exists only in the dead hours, staffed by nobody, selling stale coffee and regrets. I pressed the nozzle against my tank and watched the numbers climb. 73 degrees according to the display. But my breath came out in visible clouds. The pump clicked and whirred, the only sound except for the wind pushing across empty plains, carrying with it the smell of dust and something else. Something chemical and wrong. That's when I noticed the car. A sedan, maybe 10 years old, parked at the pump diagonal from mine. Primer gray under the sickly lights. I hadn't heard it pull in, which bothered me more than it should have. The driver's side was empty, but someone sat in the passenger seat, completely still, face turned toward me. I looked away, back to the pump display. 18 gallons. 19. When I glanced back, the passenger was still staring. Not just looking in my general direction, staring directly at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The figure raised one hand slowly and ran their tongue across their lips. The gesture so deliberate it felt rehearsed. Then the hand came up to their mouth, fingers moving in a chewing motion, mechanical and strange, like someone imitating eating without understanding what it meant. I grabbed my water bottle from the cup holder and took a long drink, just to have something to do with my hands. The passenger's head tracked my movement. When I brought the bottle away from my lips, my window fogged over from the inside, a perfect circle of condensation spreading outward from the center. My air conditioning wasn't running. The pump clicked off. I unscrewed the cap on my tank, hands moving through muscle memory while my eyes stayed fixed on that fogged window. The condensation shouldn't be there. The temperature was wrong. Everything was wrong. I risked another look at the gray sedan. The passenger seat appeared empty now, but I could see my own reflection in their passenger window, distorted by the angle and distance. The reflection was smiling. I wasn't smiling. My keys felt slippery in my palm as I locked down every door. The mechanical thunk of the locks engaging was the most comforting sound I'd heard in minutes. I started the engine and pulled out without looking back, my receipt still printing at the pump, a thin tongue of paper curling in the wind. 3 miles down the interstate, I finally checked my rearview mirror. The gas station was gone. Not dark, not distant. Gone. Where it should have been was just highway and the black expanse of prairie, empty under a moonless sky. I told myself it was the curve of the road, the natural dip in the landscape, but the highway had been straight as a ruler when I'd pulled in. My phone showed no signal. It had been fine at the station. I checked my messages while pumping gas, read a text from my brother asking when I'd arrive at his place in Rapid City. That felt like hours ago now, though the clock on my dashboard insisted only 8 minutes had passed. The white lines on the asphalt blurred into a single stream, and I realized I was going 95. I eased off the accelerator, heart hammering against my ribs. The highway stretched ahead, empty and infinite. No other headlights in either direction. At 2 in the morning, that was normal. That was fine. But it wasn't fine. I'd been driving this route for 3 hours before stopping at that station, and I'd passed maybe a dozen vehicles, seen distant ranch lights, the glow of small towns perched on the horizon. Now there was nothing. Just the cone of my headlights cutting through darkness so complete, it felt solid. A sign appeared. Rapid City, 89 miles. That was wrong. I'd been 40 miles out when I stopped for gas. I'd been watching the signs, counting down. Unless I'd somehow gotten turned around, driven the wrong direction without noticing. But the interstate only went 2 ways, and I hadn't left it. Had I? The steering wheel was cold under my hands, colder than it should be, and when I adjusted my grip, I felt moisture, not sweat, condensation. The inside of my windshield was starting to fog. I cranked the defrost to high. The fan roared to life, but the fog spread instead of clearing, creeping in from the edges like frost forming on a window. Except this was from the inside, and the temperature gauge showed 74 degrees inside the car. Something moved in my peripheral vision, a flicker in the passenger seat. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed not to look, but my eyes pulled left anyway, unable to resist. The seat was empty. Of course it was empty, but there was an indentation in the upholstery, a depression like someone had been sitting there, and the seatbelt was pulled taut across empty space, fully extended and buckled. I hadn't touched the seatbelt. My hands locked on the wheel, knuckles white. I forced myself to focus on the road, on the white lines, on staying between them. Just drive. Just keep driving. Rapid City was ahead. My brother was expecting me. This was exhaustion, too many hours behind the wheel, the mind playing tricks when the body needed rest. But the seatbelt clicked. The sound of it retracting, metal sliding against fabric, and I watched from the corner of my eye as it slowly withdrew, pulled by invisible hands back to its housing. When it stopped, the belt hung at exactly the right position for someone my height. A laugh bubbled up in my throat, high and strangled. I swallowed it. The radio was off, but I reached for it anyway, needing sound, any sound besides the hum of tires and the wind and my own ragged breathing. My fingers found the dial, static, pure white noise that rose and fell in waves, occasionally resolving into fragments that might have been words, might have been nothing. I twisted through the stations, all static. Even the emergency broadcast frequency gave me nothing but that oceanic hiss. Then, between stations, just for a second, the wet sound of someone chewing. I snapped the radio off. Silence pressed in, thicker than before. The fog on my windshield had formed patterns now, whirls and spirals that looked almost deliberate, almost like handprints pressed from the inside. I reached out to wipe them away and stopped, my hand inches from the glass. There were handprints, small ones, child-sized. No. The instructions said no children. I pushed that thought away, refused it. Not handprints, just fog patterns, pareidolia, the human brain seeing faces in clouds, meaning in randomness. But when I pulled my hand back, my own prints remained on the glass, 5 clear marks with a 6th impression beside them, smaller, with fingers that didn't quite match the geometry of human proportions. Another sign, Rapid City, 73 miles. I'd driven 16 miles. The math checked out. That was something normal, something to hold on to. The distance was decreasing. I was making progress. Soon there would be lights, other cars, the glow of the city on the horizon. The highway curved gently and my headlights swept across something on the shoulder. A car, primer gray. The same sedan from the gas station parked at an angle with its hazards flashing, painting the darkness in alternating amber. I pressed the accelerator harder. 60, 70, 80. The sedan fell behind, disappeared into the darkness. 1 mile later, there it was again. Same position on the shoulder, same flashing hazards. Impossible, but there. I stopped looking at the shoulder. I stopped checking my mirrors. I drove and drove, and the highway unreeled beneath me, and the signs counted down. 68 miles, 61 miles, 54 miles. But the darkness never changed, never lightened, and the road never offered an exit or a town or another living soul. The condensation on my windshield had spread until I was looking through a nearly opaque layer of fog. And I should have pulled over, should have stopped and wiped it clean. But I couldn't stop. Stopping was worse than driving blind. Stopping meant acknowledging this was happening, that something fundamental had broken in the geometry of the world. A voice spoke from the passenger seat, so quiet I almost missed it under the road noise. You shouldn't have looked back. My foot slammed on the brake. The car shuddered to a stop in the middle of the highway, and I sat there, chest heaving, staring straight ahead at nothing. I couldn't turn my head. If I turned my head and saw someone in that seat, saw a face and eyes and a mouth forming words, something in me would shatter permanently. You all look back, the voice continued, conversational, pleasant even. At the station, when you pull away, you always look back. I closed my eyes. You're not real. Does that matter? My hands found the door handle. I yanked it, shoved the door open, stumbled out onto the highway. The air hit me, 73 degrees that felt like ice. And I stood there in the middle of the interstate, alone under a sky without stars, without moon, without any light except my headlights pointing uselessly ahead. The car door hung open. The dome light should have been on, but the interior was dark, a darkness that seemed to pulse and breathe. I couldn't see inside. Couldn't see if the passenger seat was occupied or empty. Behind me, at the limit of my headlight's reach, something moved. Not on the road, in it. A shape rising from the asphalt itself, pulling free like someone surfacing from water, black on black and wrong in ways that hurt to perceive. I ran back to the car, threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door. The locks engaged without my touching them. The seatbelt snaked across my chest and clicked home, pulled tight enough to restrict my breathing. In the rearview mirror, the shape was closer, close enough now to see it wasn't one thing but many. A crowd of figures standing motionless in perfect formation, all facing my direction. As I watched, one in the back row raised a hand and moved it near its face in a chewing motion. I stomped on the accelerator. The car surged forward, engine screaming, speedometer climbing past 100. The figures receded, then vanished, and I was alone again on an empty highway going nowhere. The sign that appeared in my headlights read, Rapid City, 89 miles, the same distance as before, the same number, and ahead, just visible in the darkness, a faint glow that might have been a gas station, fluorescent lights humming with that particular frequency that settles behind your eyeballs and stays there. I thought about my brother, waiting for me in Rapid City. Wondered if he was still waiting, if he'd ever been waiting, if Rapid City was even a place that existed in the same world I was driving through now. My phone lay on the passenger seat, screen dark, no signal. The last text message still on the screen from hours or minutes or years ago. Let me know when you get close. The gas station grew larger ahead, its lights the only illumination in a landscape of absolute black. I could see the pumps now, the small building, a gray sedan parked at an angle. My fuel gauge read full. I'd just filled up. But my hands turned the wheel anyway, guiding the car off the interstate, into the pool of fluorescent light. The pump clicked and whirred as I approached, that familiar sound. Someone sat in the passenger seat of the gray sedan, completely still, face turned toward me. I put the car in park but didn't turn off the engine. In the window beside me, condensation began to form, spreading outward from the center in a perfect circle, despite the fact that the air conditioning wasn't running. I could see my reflection in the glass, distorted by the fog. The reflection was smiling. I wasn't smiling. The figure in the sedan raised one hand slowly to its mouth, and I understood with sudden, horrible clarity that this wasn't the gas station I'd left. This was the gas station I was arriving at, would always be arriving at. The eternal moment of stopping and seeing and not understanding what I'd seen. My phone buzzed. 1 bar of signal. A new message appeared. Let me know when you get close. I looked at the timestamp. 1:47 a.m., 15 minutes before I'd stopped at the gas station the first time, or the last time, or the only time, repeating forever in a loop of highway and darkness and fog that forms where it shouldn't, spelling out messages in a language I was only beginning to learn. The passenger seat beside me held an indentation, a depression in the upholstery, and I knew without looking that if I turned my head, I would see myself sitting there, lips moving in a chewing motion, tongue running across teeth, hand raising in a gesture that meant nothing and everything. The pump clicked off. The number on the display read 0. I hadn't started fueling. In my rearview mirror, I could see my car still parked on the interstate, door hanging open, hazards flashing in the darkness, empty. I was still there, standing on the asphalt, staring at something rising from the road. I was still driving, hands locked on the wheel, racing toward a destination that retreated with every mile. I was everywhere and nowhere, trapped in the space between stopping and leaving, between seeing and understanding. The figure in the sedan's passenger seat was gone. The seat was empty now, because the figure was sitting next to me, and always had been, wearing my face like a mask, breathing my breath, smiling my smile in reflections that showed the truth I'd refused to see. I reached for the door handle, ready to run, to escape, to break free of this loop. My hand moved in a chewing motion instead, mechanical and strange, and I watched it with detached fascination, wondering which version of me was performing the gesture, and which was observing, and whether it mattered any more in this place between the interstates, this pocket of existence where travelers stop and never quite leave, where something waits at the last pump before the highway splits. The fluorescent lights hummed, the wind pushed across empty plains. In the distance, headlights appeared on the interstate, growing closer. Someone else was about to stop for gas. Story 4. The smell hit me first. That particular combination of gasoline vapors and hot asphalt that seems to exist only at roadside stops in the middle of nowhere. My cousin had his hand on the pump nozzle, squinting against the late afternoon sun that turned everything the color of old pennies. The gas station sat exactly on the state line, one of those liminal places where the map gets fuzzy and you're not quite sure which laws apply anymore. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No other cars, no birds. Just the mechanical whir of the pump and the occasional truck growling past on the highway. Already half a mile gone by the time the sound reached us. That's when the crack split the air. Not a bang. A crack, sharp and dry, like someone had taken the atmosphere itself and snapped it in half. The front window of the convenience store fractured into an elaborate spider web, but it didn't fall. The glass just hung there, suspended in its new crystalline pattern, refracting the sunlight into 1,000 amber shards. I dropped. Pure instinct. My knees hit the concrete behind the pump, and I felt the roughness through my jeans, smelled the old oil stains and scattered cigarette butts at ground level. My cousin's legs were visible on the other side of the pump, frozen mid-step, like he couldn't decide whether to run toward the sound or away from it. The side door of the store banged open, not the front entrance with the fractured glass, but the service door facing the dumpsters. A man emerged at a pace that wasn't quite running but wasn't walking either. He wore a gray windbreaker despite the heat, and he carried a duffel bag that pulled his shoulder down with its weight. The bag's fabric had dark patches that could have been sweat or could have been something else, and I noticed how he held it away from his body, like it might contaminate him. He didn't look at us, didn't look at anything really, just moved across the parking lot with the mechanical efficiency of someone following a script, disappearing around the far edge of the building where the grass turned to gravel and the gravel turned to woods. That's when my car radio came on. I hadn't turned it on. The keys weren't even in the ignition. They were in my pocket, their metal edges pressing against my thigh where I'd crouched behind the pump. But the speakers crackled to life anyway, and through the static came a voice. Flat, procedural, like someone reading from a manual they'd memorized years ago. Código 30, Corredor Tres, Portuguese. But we were in Missouri, or Arkansas, Or the space between them where maybe language worked differently. The voice continued, but the words dissolved into interference, a sound like insects trapped in copper wire. I looked at my cousin. He was staring at the car, his face slack with the kind of confusion that comes before real fear sets in. The lights inside the store began to flicker, not all at once, but in sequence, starting from the back and rolling forward like a wave moving through water. Each fluorescent tube dimmed and brightened in turn, creating the impression that something was walking down the aisles, triggering motion sensors that didn't exist. No one came out, no clerk screaming, no customers fleeing, just the lights performing their strange synchronized dance and the radio static evolving into patterns that almost sounded like breathing. The paramedics arrived exactly 8 minutes later. I know because I'd been watching the digital display on the pump, watching the numbers increment with each passing second, while the gasoline continued to flow into my tank unattended. They came without sirens, their vehicle rolling into the lot with the quiet efficiency of people who'd done this particular route many times before. They brought screens, the kind they use in hospitals, portable partitions on wheels. They set them up around the front of the store, blocking all sight lines into the interior. I could see their shadows moving behind the translucent material, but the shadows didn't match the number of people I'd counted going inside. There were too many, or maybe too few. The shapes shifted and merged and separated again in ways that human bodies shouldn't. The manager emerged from somewhere I couldn't identify. Not from the store, not from the paramedics' vehicle, just suddenly present like he'd materialized from the heat shimmer rising off the asphalt. He was older, with the kind of weathered skin that comes from spending decades in sun and wind. He walked directly to me, his shoes making no sound despite the gritty surface of the parking lot. He asked for my receipt. The pump had stopped automatically at $40, and the paper receipt hung from the slot like a white tongue. He took it with fingers that trembled slightly, made a notation in a small spiral notebook he produced from his shirt pocket, and looked at me with eyes that didn't quite focus on my face. "You didn't see anything," he told me. Not a question, not even really a command, just a statement of fact, spoken with the certainty of someone describing the color of the sky. I wanted to argue, wanted to ask about the crack, the man with the duffel bag, the radio, the lights. But something in his tone suggested that contradiction would be dangerous in ways I couldn't articulate. My cousin's hand on my shoulder. When had he moved next to me? Squeezed once, firmly. We left. I drove. The radio stayed mercifully silent, though I kept glancing at it, expecting it to resurrect itself at any moment. My cousin sat in the passenger seat and stared out the window, his jaw working like he was chewing words he couldn't quite spit out. "Did you?" he started, then stopped. I waited. The highway unrolled ahead of us, identical mile markers ticking past. "Did you hear it too?" he finally asked. "The radio? What did you hear?" "I don't know." Couldn't make out the words, but it was wrong. The whole thing was wrong. We drove in silence for another 30 miles before stopping at a rest area. The bathroom smelled like industrial cleaner in desperation. I stood at the sink, letting cold water run over my wrists, and studied my reflection in the scratched metal mirror. Same face, same person. But something behind my eyes had shifted, like furniture rearranged in a familiar room, creating new shadows in unexpected places. When we got back to the car, there was a business card under the windshield wiper. No logo, no name, just a phone number in plain black text, and beneath it, a single word. "Remember?" My cousin plucked it from the windshield, turned it over, found nothing on the back. He held it between his thumb and forefinger like it might explode. "Someone saw us leave," he said. "Or followed us." We both scanned the parking lot, a few scattered vehicles, a family packing into an SUV, a trucker doing his pre-trip inspection, all normal, all completely, utterly normal in a way that felt like a performance. The dream started that night. Not nightmares exactly, just the gas station playing on loop. But each time, small details changed. In one version, the man in the gray windbreaker turned to look at me before he disappeared, and his face was a smooth expanse of skin with no features. In another, I watched myself from outside my body, crouched behind the pump, and I could see that I was mouthing words, counting backwards from numbers that didn't exist. In the worst one, I looked down at my hands and they were covered in dark patches like the duffel bag, and when I tried to wipe them clean, the stains spread further up my arms. I called my cousin on the third day. His voice when he answered was rough, like he hadn't slept either. "We need to talk about it," I said. Long pause. Static on the line that reminded me too much of the car radio. "There's nothing to talk about," he replied finally. "You heard the man. We didn't see anything." "But we did. Did we?" He sounded desperate now, pleading. "Because I've been trying to remember, and it's like trying to hold on to smoke. The more I reach for it, the less solid it becomes. Maybe we just saw a shoplifter. Maybe the window was already cracked. Maybe..." "The radio," I interrupted. "You asked me about the radio." Silence. Then, very quietly, "What radio?" My throat closed. "You asked me, in the car. You said you heard it too." "I don't remember saying that." "You're lying." "Maybe, or maybe you're remembering wrong. How do you know which of us is confused?" He hung up. I tried calling back 3 times, but he didn't answer. I started driving past gas stations compulsively, scanning for the one we'd stopped at. It should have been easy to find. State line, specific exit, distinctive layout. But every station I checked was wrong in small ways. Wrong angle to the road, wrong number of pumps, wrong placement of the convenience store door. On the 7th day, I found it. Or something like it. The windows were intact. A different brand of gasoline. But the smell was right. And the way the sunlight hit the asphalt matched the image burned into my memory. I pulled in. A different attendant worked the register. Younger, with tattoos covering both forearms in geometric patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed steadily. No flickering. No sequential patterns. I approached the counter. "I was here last week. There was an incident." The attendant's expression didn't change. "We don't have incidents here." "A broken window, paramedics, your manager?" "We don't have a manager. I'm the owner. Been the owner for 6 years." They gestured around the empty store. And as you can see, no broken windows. I wanted to insist, to describe what I'd witnessed in precise detail, but the words tangled in my mouth. Because now that I was here, now that I was trying to point to specific evidence, everything felt slippery. Had the window been at the front or the side? Had the man's windbreaker been gray, or had I invented that detail to give the memory shape? Had the radio spoken Portuguese, or had my mind simply assigned words to formless static? The owner was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not hostile, but not friendly either. Evaluating. "You look tired," they said finally. "Maybe you should get some rest. Memory's funny thing. Stress, lack of sleep. Brain starts filling in gaps with stories, making connections that aren't there." I left, got back in my car. The radio sat silent and dark, mocking me with its normalcy. But as I pulled onto the highway, heading back toward home and ordinary life and the comfortable fiction that everything made sense, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Just for a second. Just long enough to see the owner standing in the parking lot, watching my car recede into the distance. A small spiral notebook held in their hand. They were making a notation. The radio crackled. Not a voice this time. Just static. But in the interference, if I listened carefully, if I really concentrated, I could almost make out a rhythm. Like breathing. Like counting backwards. Like someone on the other end of a long-distance call, waiting for me to finally understand the question they'd been asking all along. I turned the radio off. The static continued. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The highway stretched ahead, mile markers ticking past, each one identical to the last. Somewhere behind me, a gas station sat on the border between 2 states, existing in both and neither, waiting for the next traveler to stop and witness something they would spend the rest of their life trying to forget they'd remembered. And somewhere ahead, in the space between stations, the static was waiting too. Patient, persistent, promising answers to questions I was no longer certain I wanted to ask. The echo of that dry crack still lived in my ears. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep. I could feel it resonating in my bones. Not a memory of a sound, but the sound itself, preserved somehow, playing on a loop in a frequency only I could hear. My cousin stopped answering my calls entirely. I drove past his apartment once and saw his car in the lot, but when I knocked, no one answered. The lights were on inside. I could see them through the gap in the curtains, flickering in that same sequential pattern, rolling from back to front like a wave. I don't go to gas stations anymore. I let my tank run until the warning light comes on, then run it further, driving on fumes and prayers until I'm somewhere busy. A truck stop with witnesses, a station in the middle of a crowded city where nothing strange could possibly happen unobserved. But sometimes, late at night, when the radio is off and the house is silent, I hear it. Código 30, Corredor Tres, and I wonder if I'm still at that gas station, still crouched behind the pump, still watching a man in a gray windbreaker carry something heavy into the woods, still waiting for the moment when someone will finally tell me what I was supposed to see, or what was supposed to see me. Story 5. The house hummed. I noticed it on the third night, lying awake in the bedroom that faced the street. Not the usual hum of a refrigerator or the distant drone of traffic. This was something else entirely. Something that seemed to originate from within the walls themselves. A low-frequency vibration that I felt more than heard, resonating in my teeth and the hollow spaces of my skull. The real estate agent had called the place charming and full of character. What she'd meant was old. Built in 1923, the two-story Craftsman had been through 4 owners in the last decade alone. The landlord, a man named Castellanos who communicated exclusively through terse emails, had been eager to rent it to me at a price that should have raised more flags than it did. But I was desperate. The divorce had left me scrambling for affordable housing, and the place came furnished, which meant I could move in with nothing but my laptop and a suitcase of clothes. The hum wasn't constant. It came and went, sometimes absent for hours, other times persisting through entire evenings. I'd find myself pausing mid-sentence while typing, fingers hovering over the keyboard, listening to that subsonic pulse threading through the floorboards. At first, I attributed it to the ancient electrical system, the kind of wiring that probably hadn't been updated since Eisenhower was president. The outlets were the old 2-prong type, and the fuse box in the basement looked like something from a museum. But then the other thing started. It began with the sensation of being watched. I'd be working at the desk in the living room, absorbed in editing a client's manuscript, when a prickling awareness would crawl up the back of my neck. I'd turn, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was never anyone there. Just the empty hallway stretching toward the kitchen, afternoon light slanting through dusty windows, illuminating nothing but air and absence. I told myself it was the stress of the move, the adjustment to living alone after 12 years of marriage. The mind plays tricks when you're isolated, when you spend too many hours in silence, broken only by the clatter of your own keyboard. I'd read about it, how solitary confinement could induce hallucinations, how the brain, starved for stimulation, would manufacture its own. But I wasn't in solitary confinement. I was just alone. The sensation grew stronger in certain rooms, the bedroom especially, and the small office on the second floor that I'd converted into a workspace after deciding the downstairs desk wasn't getting enough natural light. I'd sit there in the afternoons, sunlight streaming through the western window, and feel it, a presence hovering just beyond the periphery of my vision. If I turned my head quickly enough, I'd catch something, not quite a shadow, not quite movement, dissolving into the corner where the wall met the ceiling. I started sleeping with the lights on. The hum intensified. On the 5th night, it woke me at 3:47 a.m., so loud I could feel it in my chest, a subsonic thrumming that made my heart beat irregularly, skipping and stuttering like a damaged record. I lay there in the amber glow of the bedside lamp, staring at the ceiling, watching the old plaster seem to ripple and breathe. When I blinked, the rippling stopped. When I opened my eyes again, it resumed. I got up and walked through the house, checking every appliance, every outlet. The refrigerator was silent. The water heater in the basement sat dormant and cold to the touch. The electrical panel showed no signs of malfunction, though I wouldn't have known what to look for anyway. Everything appeared normal, yet the house continued its mechanical respiration, in and out, a rhythm that matched no heartbeat I'd ever known. In the bathroom mirror, my reflection looked older than it should have. The shadows under my eyes had deepened, and there was a gauntness to my cheeks that hadn't been there a week ago. I'd been eating, hadn't I? I tried to remember my last meal and came up blank. Time was becoming slippery, hours dissolving into one another like watercolors bleeding on wet paper. The next morning, I called an electrician. He arrived that afternoon, a heavy-set man with calloused hands and a skeptical expression. He spent 2 hours examining the wiring, testing outlets, checking the breaker box. When he emerged from the basement, he was shaking his head. "Everything looks fine," he said, though his tone suggested confusion rather than certainty. "Old system, yeah. Probably should be updated, but nothing that would cause any problems." "You sure you're hearing something?" I was sure. Or I had been sure. Standing there in the daylight with another human being present, the hum seemed like something I might have imagined. A phantom sensation, like tinnitus or phantom limb pain. I thanked him and paid his fee, watching through the window as his van pulled away, leaving me alone again with the house and its secrets. That night, I saw her for the first time. I was in the upstairs office working late on a project that had absorbed me for hours. The work was good, better than I'd done in months, and I was riding a wave of creative momentum that made time irrelevant. The hum was present but distant, almost comforting now, like white noise. I'd learned to work through it, to let it fade into the background of consciousness. Then the temperature dropped. It happened so suddenly I gasped, breath misting in air that had been warm moments before. The lamp on my desk flickered, dimmed, brightened again. And in that moment of fluctuating light, I saw her reflected in the darkened window. A figure standing behind my chair, features obscured but unmistakably feminine, dressed in what looked like a nightgown from another era. I spun around. Nothing. Empty room. Just my desk, my chair, the filing cabinet in the corner casting its long shadow across the hardwood floor. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with the house's subsonic pulse. I stood frozen, listening to the blood rushing in my ears, waiting for something else to happen. The temperature remained cold, though not as extreme as that initial plunge. Goosebumps prickled across my arms and neck. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. I sat in the living room with every light blazing, laptop open but ignored, watching the doorways and windows for movement that never came. Dawn arrived with excruciating slowness, gray light seeping through curtains, gradually washing away the shadows that had seemed so threatening in the dark. I should have left. Should have packed my things and found somewhere else to stay. Consequences be damned. But there was something keeping me there. Not quite compulsion, but something close. A curiosity that overrode my fear. A need to understand what was happening before I ran from it. Besides, where would I go? Back to my ex-wife, admitting failure and instability. To a hotel I couldn't afford? The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation, something concrete and mundane that would make sense of everything once discovered. Over the next few days, I began researching. Sleep deprivation and isolation could cause hallucinations. I knew that. But carbon monoxide poisoning could too, and old houses were notorious for it. I ordered a detector online, paid for overnight shipping, and installed it as soon as it arrived. The readings were normal. No deadly gas slowly poisoning my brain. No chemical explanation for the visions. I found articles about electromagnetic fields and their effects on the human brain. The temporal lobe, responsible for processing sensory input and memory, could be stimulated by certain frequencies of electromagnetic radiation. Strong enough fields could induce feelings of being watched, could create hallucinations, could even generate the sensation of a supernatural presence. Old, faulty wiring could produce exactly these kinds of fields. especially in houses where the electrical system was decades out of date. It made sense. It was logical, scientific, explainable. The hum I heard wasn't a hum at all. It was my own brain responding to electromagnetic stimulation. The figure I'd seen was a hallucination, a misfire of neurons triggered by invisible radiation pulsing through the walls. I wasn't going crazy. I was being affected by environmental factors beyond my control. The relief lasted exactly 3 hours. Because that night, when I came downstairs for water, I found the kitchen rearranged. Not dramatically. Nothing was on the floor or broken. But the chairs that had been pushed under the table were now pulled out, arranged in a circle as if for a meeting. The cabinet doors I always kept closed stood open, revealing neat rows of dishes I didn't remember unpacking. And on the counter, spelled out in alphabet magnets that definitely hadn't been on the refrigerator before, were 3 words: "Leave this place." My hands shook as I photographed it with my phone, needing evidence that I wasn't imagining this. The image captured everything exactly as I saw it. The chairs, the cabinets, the message. But when I looked at the photo later, reviewing it in the harsh light of morning, it showed only a normal kitchen. Chairs under the table, cabinets closed, refrigerator bare of magnets. I sat on the kitchen floor, staring at that lying photograph, feeling the last threads of my certainty unraveling. Either I was experiencing selective amnesia, rearranging things myself and not remembering, or something was very wrong with this house in ways that electromagnetic fields couldn't explain. The hum grew louder. It followed me now, room to room, a persistent vibration that seemed to emanate from whatever space I occupied. I'd move to the living room and it would be there, retreat to the bedroom, and it would follow. The only place it seemed quieter was the basement, but the basement frightened me in ways I couldn't articulate, so I avoided it. I started seeing her more frequently. Never clearly, always peripheral, always dissolving when I tried to focus. A glimpse of white fabric in the bathroom mirror, a silhouette passing across the hallway, the sense of someone sitting in the chair across from mine, breathing in time with the house's mechanical respiration. On the 14th night, I woke to find her standing beside my bed. This time, I didn't look away, didn't blink or move or give her the chance to disappear. I lay perfectly still, staring at what my mind insisted couldn't be there. A woman, translucent but visible, wearing a nightgown that might have been fashionable in the 1940s. Her face was a blur, features shifting and uncertain, but her posture conveyed something that made my blood freeze. Not threat, but desperation. She raised one arm, pointing toward the door, then to the floor, then to the door again. The gesture repeated, mechanical and insistent. Leave. She was telling me to leave. Or, another thought occurred with crystalline clarity. My own subconscious was manifesting her, using the electromagnetic stimulation as a canvas for my deepest anxieties. My brain, recognizing danger it couldn't consciously articulate, was creating this warning in the only language trauma understands: imagery and symbolism. The next morning, I called Castellanos. His response was curt, typed on a phone with autocorrect clearly disabled. No early termination, contract binding, penalty for breaking lease substantial. I considered it anyway, considered eating the financial loss and getting out. But something held me back. Pride, stubbornness, or something darker. The work I'd been producing in this house was the best of my career. Despite the sleepless nights and hallucinatory episodes, my writing had achieved a clarity and depth I'd never managed before. Clients were impressed. My reputation was recovering from the professional slump that had preceded the divorce. Whatever was happening here, electromagnetic fields stimulating my temporal lobe or actual supernatural presence, it was somehow enhancing my creative capacity. Was that worth the cost? I made my decision. I would stay, but I would document everything. Keep a journal of experiences, take photos, record audio. If this was brain damage from electromagnetic exposure, I'd have evidence for a lawsuit against Castellanos. If it was something else, I didn't let myself finish that thought. The journal entries grew increasingly disjointed. I'd write about seeing the figure in the upstairs window, then find the entry deleted the next day with no memory of removing it. I'd record audio of the hum, only to play it back and hear nothing but silence punctuated by my own breathing. The photographs showed empty rooms, but I knew with absolute certainty, that they'd been occupied when I took them. Time became more liquid. I'd sit down to work at 2 p.m. and look up to find it was midnight, hours passing in what felt like minutes. Or the reverse, staring at the clock, watching seconds stretch into eternities, each tick of the hand a small eternity. The presence, whether hallucination or entity, was constant now. I'd grown almost accustomed to it, to the sensation of being perpetually observed. We coexisted, me and this maybe ghost, occupying the same space but never quite touching. Sometimes I'd speak to her, asking questions that received no answers. Other times I'd ignore her completely, focusing on my work with determined intensity. Last night I went down to the basement. I'm not sure what compelled me. The hum was strongest there, I knew that, and I'd been avoiding it for exactly that reason. But something drew me down those wooden stairs, into the damp coolness that smelled of earth and mildew and time. The bare bulb overhead cast harsh shadows across concrete walls and exposed joists. In the corner, beneath the window too small for any human to fit through, I found them. Journals. Dozens of them, stacked in moldering cardboard boxes. They chronicled the experiences of previous tenants. All of them had felt it. The hum, the presence, the gradual dissolution of certainty. All of them had documented their descent into whatever this was, their handwriting growing increasingly erratic across pages filled with descriptions that mirrored my own experiences with disturbing precision. The last journal, dated from 8 months ago, ended mid-sentence. I understand now. It's not the house. It's not electromagnetic fields. It's not in my head. It's nothing more. Just blank pages after that, as if the writer had simply ceased to exist mid-thought. I'm writing this now from the upstairs office. The hum is louder than it's ever been, a physical force that seems to compress the air, making each breath an effort. She's standing in the corner, clearer than before, and when I look directly at her, she doesn't disappear anymore. Her face is becoming visible, not someone I recognize, but someone I might become familiar with, given time. The electromagnetic field theory still makes sense. Everything I'm experiencing could be explained by neural stimulation, by my temporal lobe firing in response to radiation from faulty wiring. The hallucinations, the time distortion, the sensation of presence, all documented effects of EM exposure. But the journals in the basement aren't a hallucination. They're real, physical, filled with experiences identical to mine, which means either every tenant who lived here experienced the same electromagnetic-induced hallucinations, possible if the wiring has been faulty for decades, or there's something else at work, something that uses the electromagnetic fields, not as cause, but as medium. A frequency of silence beneath the hum, a space between thoughts where something else can slip through. I should leave. I know this. But my latest manuscript is nearly finished, and it's brilliant. The best thing I've ever written, and possibly the best thing I'll ever write. Just a few more days, a week at most. The figure is moving closer now, and I can see that her expression isn't threatening at all. It's sympathetic, sad even. She knows what I haven't yet accepted, that the question of whether this is real or hallucination has become irrelevant. The electromagnetic fields have opened something in my temporal lobe, a door, a sensitivity, a frequency I can't unhear. And once you start hearing it, once you tune into that particular silence beneath the hum, you can't tune back out. The house hums, and I hum with it, and somewhere in that resonance, I'm becoming part of whatever this place is. Not dying. That would be too simple. Transforming, perhaps. Or just tuning in. I'll finish the manuscript, then I'll decide whether to leave. But I think we both know I won't. Story 6. The apartment smelled wrong from the first moment I stepped inside. Not rotten, not moldy. Nothing I could identify or complain about to the landlady who stood in the doorway behind me, keys jangling in her weathered hands. It was more like the air itself had grown stale from disuse, thick with the residue of previous occupants whose presence still clung to the walls like humidity. The late afternoon sun struggled through grimy windows, casting everything in a jaundiced light that made the cramped space feel even smaller. The landlady said something in rapid Japanese, her tone suggesting this was a bargain I shouldn't refuse. My rudimentary language skills caught maybe one word in 5. I nodded anyway. After 3 weeks of overpriced hotels in Tokyo, I needed a long-term rental for my research fellowship, and my advisor had been clear. The grant money wouldn't stretch to luxury accommodations. This neighborhood in the older part of the city would have to do, even if the building had probably stood since before the war. Even if the tatami mats showed wear patterns from decades of footsteps. Even if something about the place made my skin prickle. I paid the deposit in cash. The landlady left me with a bow and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. That first night, I told myself the sounds were just the building settling. Old structures make noise. Everyone knows this. The creak of wood contracting in the cooling evening air, the whisper of wind through gaps in the window frames, the distant rumble of the subway line 2 blocks away. All perfectly explicable. I unpacked my research materials and tried to focus on the reason I'd come to Japan in the first place, my dissertation on cross-cultural interpretations of apparitional experiences. 6 months of interviews, observations, and archival research stretched ahead of me. The irony wasn't lost on me even then. I woke sometime after midnight to find myself sitting upright in the futon, heart hammering, skin slick with sweat. The room pressed in around me, darker than it should have been given the streetlights outside. For several seconds I couldn't remember where I was, couldn't orient myself in the unfamiliar space. Then memory returned, and with it, the certainty that had jolted me awake. Someone had been watching me sleep. Not watching anymore. Had been watching. Past tense. The distinction felt crucial. I fumbled for my phone and activated its flashlight, sweeping the beam across the empty apartment. Nothing. No one. The door remained locked from the inside, the windows shut tight. I checked anyway, my hands shaking slightly as I tested each latch. Everything secure. I returned to the futon but didn't sleep again that night, lying awake as the hours crawled toward dawn, trying to convince myself it had been a dream. The work helped at first. I threw myself into it with the fervor of someone trying to outrun their own thoughts. My research took me to shrines and temples, to interviews with priests and spiritual practitioners, to archives filled with centuries-old accounts of yurei and other supernatural entities. I recorded everything meticulously, maintaining the scholarly distance my methodology required. These were cultural artifacts, I reminded myself. Belief systems shaped by historical context and social structures. Fascinating from an anthropological perspective, but not literally real. Yet everywhere I went, people spoke of the dead with such casual certainty. An elderly priest described the proper rituals for pacifying restless spirits with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to explain traffic rules. A middle-aged woman I interviewed detailed her deceased grandmother's visits with perfect clarity, explaining how she'd known it wasn't a dream because she could smell her grandmother's particular brand of face powder. A college student told me about the shadow she sometimes glimpsed in her peripheral vision, always in the same corner of her apartment, always disappearing when she turned her head. I typed up their accounts with increasingly unsteady fingers, telling myself I was just tired, adjusting to the new environment, probably not eating well enough. The rational explanations piled up like sandbags against a rising flood. 3 weeks into my stay, I woke to find the tokonoma alcove rearranged. I'd placed my laptop and research notes on the raised platform, but now they sat on the floor beside it, while the empty space held only shadows. I stood staring at the alcove for a full minute, trying to remember if I'd moved the items myself. Perhaps I'd been sleepwalking, but I had no history of that, and the memory of placing the laptop there the previous evening remained crystal clear. The apartment began to feel different after that, smaller maybe, or the walls somehow closer than they'd been. I started noticing things I'd overlooked before. The way the bathroom door wouldn't stay fully closed, drifting open an inch or two no matter how firmly I shut it. The cold spot near the kitchen area, a pocket of air that felt like walking into refrigerated space even on warm evenings. The sound of footsteps in the apartment above me, except there was no apartment above me. I occupied the top floor. I mentioned none of this in my research notes. What would I even write? That I was experiencing the very phenomena I'd come to study? That my carefully maintained academic objectivity was eroding like old paper exposed to moisture? My advisor would think I was losing it, going native in the worst possible way, allowing the local belief system to colonize my rational mind. Maybe she'd be right. The dreams started in the 4th week. Not nightmares exactly, nothing overt enough to wake me screaming. Instead, I'd find myself walking through the apartment in my sleep, or believing I was awake when I wasn't, or perhaps actually awake but unable to trust my own perception. In these nocturnal wanderings, the space transformed. The walls breathed. The shadows moved with intention rather than as mere absence of light. And always, always, the sensation of being observed. During one of these episodes, I found myself standing in front of the closet, my hand on the sliding door, absolutely certain that something waited on the other side. Not someone, something. The distinction felt important then, though in the morning I couldn't articulate why. I stood frozen, caught between the compulsion to open the door and the bone-deep knowledge that doing so would fundamentally alter something I couldn't name. Eventually I stepped back, returned to the futon. The closet remained closed. I tried to convince myself it had been a dream, but my feet were dirty in the morning, gritty with dust from the apartment floor. My interviews became harder to conduct. I'd sit across from someone describing their supernatural experiences, and instead of analyzing their narrative through theoretical frameworks, I'd find myself searching their face for signs they were telling the truth. Did they really see their dead husband at the foot of their bed? Could spirits actually manipulate physical objects? Was there truly a thin space between the living and the dead? And if so, what happened when you accidentally stepped into it? One interviewee, an elderly man who'd survived the firebombing of Tokyo as a child, looked at me with sharp, assessing eyes and asked if I was sleeping well. The question came in English, which surprised me. He'd been speaking Japanese up until that point. I assured him I was fine, thank you. He nodded slowly, then told me about a concept I'd encountered before in my research but never fully understood. The idea that some places hold on to the past like wet cloth holds water. Not haunted exactly, but saturated with memory, with emotion, with the residue of lives lived and ended. He suggested I might be staying in such a place. Then he suggested I might want to stay somewhere else. I thanked him for his concern, but dismissed the advice. I had 5 months left on my lease. My research required me to be embedded in the local community. And besides, I wasn't going to let superstition dictate my living arrangements. I was a rational person, a scholar. I dealt in evidence and analysis, not folk belief and cultural anxiety. That night, I woke to find all the lights in the apartment on. Every single one. The overhead fixtures, the small lamp in the alcove, even the bathroom light, its fluorescent glow spilling across the floor like something liquid. I sat up slowly, my breath shallow, scanning the illuminated space. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing seemed out of place. But I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't turned on those lights, and the switches weren't the type that could flip themselves. I rose and moved through the apartment, checking each light, each room, each corner. The bathroom door stood wide open. The closet remained mercifully closed. In the kitchen area, the cold spot felt colder than ever, and I could see my breath misting in front of my face despite the warm autumn weather. Then I noticed the photographs. I'd tacked several images to the wall above my desk, family pictures from home, meant to make the space feel less foreign. Now they all faced backward, the tacks still in place but the images reversed, their blank backs staring at me like closed eyes. My hands trembled as I turned them around, one by one, trying to remember if I'd done this myself. Had I had another sleepwalking episode? But these were pushpin tacks. I would have needed to deliberately remove each photo and replace it backward. That wasn't something you could do unconsciously. I left the lights on when I returned to the futon. Sleep felt dangerous somehow, like lowering your guard in enemy territory. The boundary between waking and sleeping dissolved after that. I'd find myself mid-conversation with colleagues and realize I'd lost minutes, maybe hours, with no memory of what I'd said or done. Simple tasks became complex as my concentration fractured. I'd start making tea and find myself standing in front of the stove with no recollection of having turned it on, the kettle beginning to whistle. I'd sit down to type up interview notes and discover my fingers had written the same sentence over and over. It sees me, it sees me, it sees me. My appearance deteriorated. The mirror in the bathroom reflected someone I barely recognized, hollow-eyed, unshaven, skin gray with exhaustion. I started avoiding my own reflection, keeping my gaze down when I brushed my teeth or washed my face. Something about my reflection bothered me, though I couldn't identify what. Just a feeling, a wrongness. The sense that the person looking back wasn't quite aligned with the person looking. I researched the building's history when I should have been working on my dissertation. The landlady proved unhelpful, claiming not to know much about previous tenants, but I found records at the local ward office. The building had stood for 70 years. Multiple families had cycled through my particular apartment, none staying longer than a year. The records listed no deaths on the property, which should have been reassuring, but somehow wasn't. An elderly neighbor I'd never spoken to stopped me on the stairs one evening. She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then said something in Japanese too rapid for me to follow. I apologized, explaining in broken phrases that my Japanese wasn't very good. She switched to halting English, her accent thick, but her meaning clear. "Leave this place. It isn't for you." When I asked why, she simply shook her head and continued down the stairs, leaving me standing alone in the dim stairwell, wondering what she'd seen in my face that prompted such a warning. I should have left. I knew that even then, in whatever part of my mind still functioned normally, but leaving felt like admitting defeat, like surrendering to irrationality, like proving that all my academic training meant nothing when confronted with the inexplicable. I was here to study supernatural beliefs, not succumb to them. I was a researcher, an observer, not a participant. The distinction grew harder to maintain. Objects continued to move. I'd place my keys in one location and find them in another. Books I'd shelved would appear on the floor, their pages open to passages I didn't remember reading. Once, I discovered my research notes rearranged, not scattered, but deliberately organized in a pattern I couldn't decipher, like someone had been searching for something specific and left breadcrumbs of their investigation. The apartment began to smell different. That initial staleness had evolved into something more complex, more organic. Sometimes like incense, though I burned none. Sometimes like old paper and dust. Sometimes like nothing I could name, just an odor that registered as wrong on some deep, instinctive level. And the presence grew stronger. I stopped thinking of it as a mere sensation and began to conceptualize it as an entity, though what kind I couldn't say. Not malevolent exactly, not protective either, just present, watching, waiting for something I couldn't identify. Its attention felt like weight, like pressure, like standing too close to a large animal and feeling the heat of its body, the rhythm of its breathing. I started talking to it sometimes, late at night when rationality felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. I'd sit in the darkness. I'd given up on keeping the lights on. They never stayed on anyway. And address the empty air. I asked who it was, what it wanted, why it had chosen me, if it had chosen me, or if I'd somehow chosen it by coming to this place, this building, this specific apartment in a city of millions. It never answered, not in words. But sometimes in the silence following my questions, I'd hear sounds I couldn't quite identify. A shifting, a settling, like something adjusting its position in response to being acknowledged. My advisor emailed, concerned about my progress reports growing increasingly sparse and incoherent. I assured her everything was fine. I was simply deeply immersed in the research. The lie felt thin even as I typed it. But what was the alternative? Tell her I'd become what I was studying? That the analytical framework I'd built my career on was crumbling? That I no longer knew if I was observing cultural phenomena or experiencing them firsthand? I attended fewer interviews, left my apartment less frequently. The outside world felt aggressive in its normalcy. Bright lights, loud sounds, people moving with purpose and certainty. Inside my rented space, time moved differently. Day and night lost their distinction. I'd look up from my laptop to find hours had passed, or minutes. The ordinary flow of temporal progression replaced by something more fluid, more elastic. The closet door finally opened. I didn't open it. I wouldn't have, couldn't have. But one morning, or evening, I'd lost track. I found it standing wide, the darkness inside absolute despite the daylight that should have illuminated it. I approached slowly, every instinct screaming at me to turn away, to leave, to run. But curiosity proved stronger than fear, that fundamental human need to understand, to know, to categorize and explain. I looked inside. Nothing, just my few hanging clothes, the shelf above holding spare bedding. Completely ordinary, utterly mundane. Yet staring into that space, I felt something shift in my perception, like a camera adjusting focus, like seeing one of those optical illusions where faces become vases or staircases, reverse direction. The apartment wasn't haunted. I understood that with sudden, terrible clarity. It wasn't holding the past like wet cloth holds water. It wasn't saturated with memory or emotion, or the residue of previous lives. It was doing something else entirely. Something I lacked the framework to understand, the language to describe, the cultural context to interpret correctly. My American, academic, rationalist worldview simply didn't have room for what was happening, so my mind kept trying to force it into familiar shapes. Ghost, spirit, psychological breakdown. But maybe it was none of those things. Maybe it was something that existed in the gaps between cultural understandings, something that required a different way of seeing to perceive accurately. Or maybe I'd simply lost my mind, and these attempts at explanation were just my brain's desperate effort to make sense of its own dissolution. I closed the closet door. It stayed closed this time. My visa expires in 4 months. I could leave earlier if I wanted. There's no legal requirement to stay. No contract binding me to this apartment or this research or this increasingly unstable version of reality. I could pack my belongings, forfeit the remainder of my lease, return to the familiar terrain of my American university where ghosts are metaphors, and the supernatural is always someone else's belief system. But I haven't left yet. I tell myself it's because I need to complete the research, fulfill the grant requirements, gather enough data to support my dissertation. But late at night, sitting in the apartment that no longer feels entirely empty, I wonder if the real reason is simpler and more disturbing. I'm not sure I want to know anymore whether this is real or imagined, cultural interpretation or genuine supernatural phenomenon, external presence or internal collapse. The ambiguity has become almost comfortable, a state I've learned to inhabit the way one learns to live with chronic pain. Not cured, just adapted. The landlady stopped by yesterday. She looked at me with that same expression the elderly neighbor had worn, that mixture of concern and resignation, and asked if I was sure I wanted to stay. I could break the lease, she said. No penalty. She'd refund my deposit. Her English had suddenly improved, as though she'd been concealing her fluency all along, waiting for the right moment to use it. I told her I was fine. I'd see out my full term. She nodded, unsurprised, and said something as she left that I'm still trying to translate accurately. Some people can walk through thin places without noticing. Others step through and can't find their way back. Tonight, as I write this, the apartment feels more crowded than usual. Not threatening, not comforting, just occupied. The presence that has become my constant companion settles into its familiar position, behind me, to the left, just outside my peripheral vision. I could turn and look, but I've learned not to. Some things lose their definition when observed directly, existing more solidly in the space between seeing and not seeing. My laptop screen flickers slightly, and for just a moment, I see my reflection superimposed on the document I'm typing. But the reflection is wrong in that way I couldn't identify before. It's not the angle or the lighting. It's that my reflection is looking at something I can't see, its attention focused on a point just over my shoulder, its expression caught between fear and fascination. I keep typing. The apartment breathes around me. The footsteps resume above, in the space where no apartment exists. The bathroom door drifts open, and I don't bother closing it anymore. Tomorrow, I have 3 interviews scheduled. I'll attend them, ask my questions, record the responses. I'll take notes on how these people interpret their inexplicable experiences through the lens of their cultural conditioning, their belief systems, their frameworks for understanding the supernatural. And I won't mention that I no longer know which side of the observation I'm on, whether I'm the researcher studying the phenomenon or the phenomenon being studied, whether the presence I feel is a eerie, a manifestation of my deteriorating mental state, or something else entirely. Something that exists in the space between categories, between cultures, between the rational and the inexplicable. The closet door is open again. I didn't hear it slide, but there it is, that rectangle of absolute darkness in my peripheral vision. This time, I think something is looking out instead of me looking in. This time, I think the watching has reversed, but I could be wrong. About all of it. About everything. That's the worst part, I realize. Not the fear or the uncertainty or the slow erosion of my grip on consensus reality. It's knowing I'll never be sure about what I've experienced or what I've imagined, about what's real and what I've simply learned to see, because this culture's framework has seeped into my awareness like water into dry soil, about whether I'm documenting a phenomenon or becoming one. The laptop screen flickers again. My reflection stares at something behind me. I don't turn around. I keep typing. Story 7. Or the radio died first. Not with static or fade, but with a wet click that sounded like something swallowing. One moment I was listening to news about the turnpike workers' strike. Day 17, negotiations stalled, skeleton crews only. And the next there was silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. I reached for the dial, but my hand stopped halfway. The silence had texture to it, a quality that made me reluctant to break it. That's when I saw the exit sign for 242, fluorescent green against the November dark, and my fuel gauge kissing empty. The Pennsylvania Turnpike stretched behind me like a long black throat, swallowing the miles I'd covered since Pittsburgh. Ahead, nothing but more darkness punctuated by the occasional reflector post catching my headlights. No other cars had passed in either direction for the last 40 minutes. The strike had gutted traffic, turned one of America's busiest highways into a concrete ribbon of absence. I took the exit. The off-ramp curved down and away from the elevated roadway, descending through a corridor of naked trees that pressed close on both sides, their branches interlaced overhead, creating a tunnel that my headlights barely penetrated. I noticed my speedometer then. The needle sat perfectly still at 47 mph, even though I could feel the car decelerating. When I touched the brake, the needle didn't move. When I pressed the gas, it remained frozen. The trees opened up abruptly, and there it was. A McDonald's connected to a gas station, the only light for miles. The golden arches glowed with an intensity that seemed wrong somehow. Too bright. The yellow bleeding into the surrounding dark like yolk from a cracked egg. Fluorescent lights blazed in the station canopy, creating a rectangle of harsh illumination that made everything beyond it seem darker by contrast. I pulled in slowly, my tires crunching over gravel that shouldn't have been there. The lot was paved, I could see that clearly, but I could hear gravel. The sound followed me all the way to the pumps. A police cruiser sat at an angle near the convenience store entrance, blocking 2 parking spaces. Not parked, positioned. Nose out, back end against the curb, doors closed, completely dark inside. The light bar on its roof threw no reflection. I stared at it for a long moment, waiting for movement, for the glow of a laptop or phone inside, for any sign that someone was just sitting there quietly. Nothing. I killed my engine. In the sudden quiet, I could hear a low electrical hum emanating from everywhere and nowhere. The kind of sound you feel in your teeth before you consciously register it. The air smelled of ozone and old fryer oil, an acrid combination that coated the back of my throat. The pump looked normal enough. I got out, the cold November air hitting my face with unexpected force, and walked to the island. My footsteps echoed wrong, too loud, with a hollow quality that suggested the pavement wasn't quite solid beneath me. When I slid my credit card into the reader, the screen remained black for a count of 5 before displaying 2 words in blocky green text, out of service. I tried again, slower this time, making sure the magnetic strip aligned properly. Same result, same delay, same 2 words. It works fine. Try it again. The voice came from my left and I spun toward it. A man stood at the edge of the canopy, just where the light met the dark. Medium height, wearing a windbreaker despite the cold, holding an umbrella at his side even though the sky was clear. I hadn't heard him approach, hadn't seen him in my peripheral vision. He had simply appeared, as if he'd been standing there the entire time, and I'd only just now acquired the ability to perceive him. His face was wrong in a way I couldn't immediately identify. All the parts were there, arranged correctly, but something in the proportions or the spacing created an uncanny valley effect that made my stomach clench. His smile looked painted on. I glanced at the pump screen again. Out of service. When I looked back, the man had moved closer, not walked, moved, and was now standing just 3 feet away. The umbrella hung from his hand, tip touching the ground. It wasn't raining. It wasn't going to rain. The umbrella made no sense. Try it again, he repeated, his tone identical to before. Same inflection, same cadence. It works fine. His eyes didn't blink. I counted to 10 in my head, watching. Not once. I slid my card through a 3rd time, and this time, the pump beeped agreeably. The screen flickered through its sequence. Card approved. Select grade. Begin fueling. I selected regular and lifted the nozzle, my hand shaking slightly as I unscrewed my gas cap. The numbers on the pump display rolled backward. 999, 99 gallons, 998, 98, 997, 97. The counter was running in reverse. You see? The man said, still in that same flat tone. Works fine. Try it again. But he'd already told me it worked. The repetition sat in my ear like an insect, burrowing. I squeezed the pump trigger. Nothing came out. The nozzle was dry, the hose was dry, and the numbers kept counting backward. 854. 32 gallons now. 853. 31. 852. 30. The automatic doors of the McDonald's suddenly hissed open. No one was there. They stayed open for exactly 7 seconds. I counted, then slammed shut with enough force that I heard the glass rattle. A beat of silence. Then they opened again. Closed. Opened. Closed. The rhythm was wrong, too fast, like something breathing rapidly in panic or excitement. Try it again, the man said, and this time I realized he hadn't moved his mouth. The words came from behind his smile, from somewhere deeper in his throat, or maybe from the air around him. It works fine. Try it again. I dropped the nozzle and took a step back. The man lifted his umbrella in a smooth mechanical motion, raising it above his head and opening it with a snap of fabric. The underside should have been black or navy or whatever color the outside was. Instead, it was lined with something that caught the fluorescent light and reflected it back in a way that fabric shouldn't. Glossy, almost liquid. And mounted to the central pole, secured with layers of electrical tape gone brown with age, was a camera. The lens pointed directly at me. A small red light pulsed beside it. The man tilted the umbrella, adjusting the angle, and I saw his face more clearly in the reflected light. His eyes were completely black, sclera and all, like they'd been painted over. His smile hadn't changed, hadn't moved. It was exactly the same as before because it had never been a real expression. It was a fixture, something carved or drawn onto a surface that only approximated flesh. Try it again, he said. But now the voice came from the camera, a speaker hidden inside it producing a recording. It works fine. Try it again. Try it again. Try it again. The police car's light bar suddenly blazed to life, flooding the station in alternating red and blue. No siren, just the lights, spinning in silence. In the stuttering illumination, I saw things I'd missed before. The McDonald's windows were covered on the inside with newspaper, yellowed and peeling. The door to the convenience store was chained shut, rust bleeding down from the lock. The pumps, all 6 of them, had out-of-order bags over their nozzles, all except mine. And there were other umbrellas. In the darkness beyond the canopy, arranged in a rough semicircle, at least a dozen umbrellas stood open and still. Each one had that same wet gleam on the underside. Each one had a camera. The red recording lights made a constellation in the dark, unblinking eyes watching me from every angle. The man, the thing, with the umbrella took another step closer. His feet made no sound. The electrical hum I'd noticed before increased in pitch, became almost painful. The receipt printer at the pump suddenly whirred to life, spitting out foot after foot of blank white paper that coiled on the ground like something expelled. Try it again. It works fine. Try it again. More voices now, coming from all the cameras simultaneously, slightly out of sync, creating a nauseating echo. The umbrella nearest to me began to move, drifting sideways without anyone carrying it, adjusting its angle to keep me in frame. The others followed suit, converging slowly, tightening their circle. I ran. My car was only 15 feet away, but the distance stretched as I moved, the ground pulling at my feet like mud even though it was dry pavement. I fumbled with my door handle, my hands clumsy with adrenaline, and threw myself inside. The door wouldn't close properly at first. Something was wrong with the alignment, or the frame had warped, or the air itself had thickened into something resistant. I hauled on it with both hands until it finally sealed with a sound like tearing fabric. Engine. Key. Ignition. The car coughed but didn't start. I twisted the key harder, pumping the gas. Still nothing. Through my windshield, I watched the umbrellas gliding closer, smooth and purposeful, the man-shaped thing standing perfectly still among them with its permanent smile and drowned eyes. The police lights continued their silent rotation, painting everything in colors that didn't quite match reality. The reds too red, the blues almost ultraviolet. The camera under the nearest umbrella was close enough now that I could see myself in the lens, distorted, stretched vertically, my face elongated into something skull-like and terrified. Behind my reflection, I saw the actual me inside the car, saw myself seeing myself, an infinite regression of observations that made my vision swim. On the 4th try, my engine caught. I slammed into reverse without looking, tires screaming against pavement that suddenly offered no resistance, like driving on ice. The umbrellas scattered. No, not scattered. They moved in precise formation, clearing a path. They wanted me to leave, or wanted me to think I could leave. I spun the wheel, shifting into drive, and accelerated toward the exit. In my rearview mirror, the police car's lights were still spinning. The man-thing hadn't moved. It stood exactly where it had been, umbrella raised, watching me go with its recorded voice still echoing across the lot. Try it again. It works fine. Try it again. The exit fed back onto the turnpike. I took the on-ramp too fast, nearly losing control on the curve. But I didn't care. I needed distance. Needed to put miles between myself and that place. Needed the normalcy of highway driving to anchor me back to something that made sense. The turnpike welcomed me with darkness. No other cars, no lights except my own headlights cutting through the November night. I drove for what felt like an hour, watching for the next exit, for any sign of civilization, but there was nothing. Just mile markers appearing in my headlights and disappearing behind me. Mile 242, mile 242, mile 242. The same marker over and over. I'd passed it 17 times now. My odometer wasn't moving. My fuel gauge still read empty, but the car kept running. The speedometer needle remained frozen at 47 ampere no matter how hard I pressed the accelerator. I picked up my phone. No signal. The screen showed 3:33 a.m., but my watch read 11:47 p.m. I checked the time on my dashboard clock. 6:66. Impossible numbers. Broken numbers. That's when I saw the lights ahead. Golden arches, glowing too bright against the dark. A gas station. A police car parked at an angle. All the same. Exit 242. I wasn't on the turnpike anymore. Or I was, but the turnpike had become something else, folded in on itself, a loop that only ran through one exit. I could drive forever and only arrive here. I took the exit because I had no choice. The off-ramp appeared whether I wanted it or not, pulling my car down into that corridor of skeletal trees. The descent felt longer this time, deeper, the trees pressing closer until branches scraped my windows with sounds like fingernails on glass. The station appeared exactly as before. The man-thing waited under the canopy, umbrella furled at his side. The police lights were dark now. Everything was darker, actually, as if the fluorescent bulbs were dimming, dying slowly. The McDonald's was completely black inside. I didn't get out. I sat in my car with the engine running, doors locked, and stared at the figure under the lights. It stared back, didn't approach, didn't move. Just stood there with its painted smile and drowned eyes, waiting with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. My radio suddenly crackled to life, not with music or news, but with that voice. Try it again, it works fine. Try it again. Playing on every station, FM and AM, all saying the same thing in perfect unison. I punched buttons frantically, trying to turn it off, but the volume only increased. In my rearview mirror, I saw umbrellas emerging from the darkness at the lot's edge. Dozens now, hundreds, a forest of them, each with its wet gleaming interior and mounted camera, each recording light burning in the dark like embers. They were forming a wall behind me, blocking any retreat. The man-thing finally moved. It walked toward my car with that same mechanical smoothness, closing the distance in strides that covered too much ground. When it reached my door, it bent down and looked through the window. Its face was inches from mine, separated only by glass. I could see that its skin wasn't skin at all. It was paper, layered and shellacked, a papier-mâché construction that had been animated somehow, given awful life. It raised one hand and knocked on my window. 3 precise taps. Then it pointed past me, toward the passenger seat. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me not to turn my head, but I couldn't help it. My body moved without my permission, neck craning, eyes shifting. There was an umbrella on my passenger seat. It hadn't been there before. I knew with absolute certainty it hadn't been there before. But now it was, closed and resting against the seat as if I'd placed it there myself. And even though it was closed, even though I couldn't see the underside, I knew what was there. Could feel the lens watching me, recording me, documenting this moment for whatever purpose these things served. The man-thing straightened up and walked back to its position under the canopy. The umbrellas behind me didn't advance, but they didn't retreat either. The wall held firm. My radio continued its mantra, the same phrase over and over until the words lost meaning and became pure sound. I put my hand on the umbrella handle. It was cold. Not just cold, but wrong cold. The kind of temperature that burns. My fingers closed around it anyway. What else could I do? I lifted it, feeling its weight, too heavy for what it should be. Something inside shifted, clicked. When I turned it over, I saw the camera taped to the central pole, saw the red recording light, saw my own face in the lens, distorted and strange, like looking at someone who wore my features but wasn't quite me. And behind that reflection, I saw the car interior, saw myself sitting there, saw the umbrella in my hands. The radio cut out. The silence returned with that same textured pressure, and in that silence, I heard my own voice coming from the camera's speaker, tinny and distant but unmistakably mine. Try it again. It works fine. Try it again. I'm still here, still parked under these lights that never dim completely. The man-thing stands in its place, waiting. The umbrellas surround me in their patient circle. My fuel gauge reads empty, but my engine keeps running. My clocks show impossible times. My radio speaks with my voice. Sometimes I think I should drive away, take the on-ramp, try to break the loop, find an exit that leads somewhere else. But I know now that there is nowhere else. There's only exit 242, replaying itself forever, and I'm part of it now. Part of the recording. part of whatever this place is documenting. The worst part isn't the fear anymore. The worst part is that I'm starting to understand the pattern, starting to see the logic behind it. Sometimes I find myself reaching for my door handle, thinking that maybe I should get out, walk to the pump, try my card again. It would work this time. I'm certain it would work this time. And when it does, when I'm standing there with the nozzle in my hand and the numbers counting backward, I'll look up and see another car pulling in. Someone else running low on fuel. Someone else who took an exit they can't leave. I'll walk toward them. I'll smile. I'll offer them help. I'll tell them it works fine. To try it again. The umbrella sits in my lap now, open above me, even though I'm inside my car. The camera records everything. The red light pulses like a heartbeat, and I wait, just like the others, for the next car to arrive, because someone has to show them how it works. Someone has to help them try it again. Story 8. The real estate agent called it character. I called it cheap rent in a city where my salary barely covered groceries. The house stood at the end of Maple Street, its Victorian bones sagging under a century of gravity and neglect. Paint peeled from the siding like dead skin, and the porch steps groaned a warning I should have heeded. I moved in on a Tuesday in late October, when the trees had already surrendered their leaves, and the air carried that peculiar smell of decay that announces winter's approach. The landlord, an elderly woman who refused to meet my eyes, handed me 2 keys on a tarnished ring and mentioned something about the house settling. "Old places do that," she said. "They talk to you. Get used to it." The first week passed in a blur of unpacking and arranging furniture in rooms that never seemed quite square. Every corner felt slightly off, angles that didn't meet at 90 degrees, floors that sloped subtly toward the center of the house, as if the whole structure was slowly collapsing inward. I told myself it was normal. Houses built in 1887 weren't constructed with laser levels and modern precision. They shifted. They settled. They creaked and groaned like old men rising from chairs. But the sound started on the 8th night. I woke at 3:17 in the morning to what I can only describe as footsteps. Not the random pops and cracks of cooling wood that I'd grown accustomed to, but a deliberate pattern. Step, pause, step, pause. The rhythm of someone walking slowly down the hallway outside my bedroom door. The floorboards announced each footfall with a low groan that seemed to vibrate through the walls and into my chest. I lay frozen in bed, my breath shallow and careful, listening. The footsteps reached my door and stopped. I stared at the gap beneath it, waiting for shadows to interrupt the thin line of ambient light from the street lamp outside. Nothing. Just silence thick enough to taste. Eventually, I convinced myself it was the house settling. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees that evening. Wood contracts in the cold. It expands in heat. Basic physics. I repeated this to myself until my heart rate normalized and sleep reclaimed me. The next morning, I examined the hallway floor in daylight, looking for loose boards or gaps that might explain the sound. The hardwood looked solid enough, though worn smooth by decades of use. I walked the length of the hall several times, trying to recreate the pattern I'd heard. The boards did creak, but not with the same deliberate rhythm, not with that purposeful cadence that had woken me. Over the following days, I began to notice other things. The bathroom mirror was positioned at an odd angle, tilted slightly forward from the wall. When I stood at certain spots in the hallway, I could see my own reflection appearing and disappearing in the corner of my vision. A flickering presence that made me turn suddenly, convinced someone stood behind me. I adjusted the mirror, leveling it properly, but the next morning found it tilted again, as if the wall itself rejected my attempts at correction. The pipes were worse. They didn't just clank when I ran water. They moaned. Deep, resonant sounds that seemed to come from the basement, traveling up through the walls with a pitch that wavered between mechanical and organic. At night, when the house was quiet and I lay reading in bed, The pipes would suddenly shudder to life with sounds like someone drawing a long, shaking breath. The first time it happened, I bolted upright, book tumbling to the floor, certain that someone was in the basement, gasping for air. I went down there only once. The basement was everything a basement in a house like this should be. Low ceilings, exposed beams, walls of crumbling brick that wept moisture. The furnace crouched in the corner like a metal beast, its pilot light a single orange eye in the darkness. The pipes ran along the ceiling, old iron things covered in decades of paint. And when I touched one, I felt it vibrate with some internal current that had nothing to do with water flow. That's when I heard it. A sound from the far corner of the basement, where the darkness seemed especially thick, where my flashlight beam didn't quite reach. A scraping sound. Slow. Methodical. Like something being dragged across the concrete floor. I didn't investigate. I climbed those stairs faster than I'd moved in years, and I didn't go back down. The furnace could fail. The pipes could burst. I would call a plumber, an HVAC technician, anyone but me. The basement could keep its secrets, but the house wouldn't let me forget. The scraping sound returned that night, drifting up through the heating vents with perfect clarity, and with it came the footsteps again, that same deliberate pattern in the hallway. This time I forced myself to open the bedroom door. The hallway stretched before me, empty and dim. The single bulb at the far end cast weak yellow light that made the walls seem to pulse. I stepped out, the floor cold against my bare feet, and moved toward the stairs. Each board beneath my feet announced my presence, but beneath my own sounds I heard it, the other footsteps, keeping pace with mine, slightly behind, slightly to the left. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. I spun around. Nothing. Just the hallway, the tilted mirror catching my reflection, multiplying me in the darkness. But in that reflection, for just a moment, I saw myself from behind, saw my own back receding down the hall, moving away from me while I stood still. The mirror had to go. The next day, I took it down, revealing a wall discolored in the shape of the frame, the paint darker where the mirror had hung. But that night, lying in bed, I could still see movement in my peripheral vision, still catch those glimpses of something shifting in the corner of my eye. The mirror was gone, but its ghost remained, and I understood then that the house had trained me to see things that weren't there, had taught my brain to expect motion in the shadows. The drafts were the worst. They came from nowhere and everywhere, cold fingers of air that traced lines across my skin when I sat reading in the evening. I checked every window, sealed the gaps with weather stripping, stuffed towels under the doors. Still, the drafts found me. They moved through the house with intelligence, seeking out the warmest spots, circling around me until I felt surrounded by invisible presence. I started sleeping less. When I did sleep, I dreamed of the house as it must have been when new, fresh paint and straight lines, filled with voices and laughter. But even in dreams, I could hear the pipes moaning, could feel the floors beginning their century-long sag toward the center. I dreamed of the house learning to mimic human sounds, teaching itself through decades of listening to the people who lived within its walls. By the third week, I was making excuses to stay late at work, to arrive home only when exhaustion made sleep unavoidable. But the house was patient. It waited for me in the darkness, its wooden bones shifting and settling, its pipes singing their hollow songs, its mirrors reflecting things that moved just beyond the edge of perception. I began to research the house's history, spending lunch breaks at the library, scrolling through old newspaper archives and property records. The house had changed hands 17 times since its construction. No one stayed longer than 2 years. Most left after 6 months. The records didn't explain why, offered no dramatic stories of tragedy or death. People simply left, selling quickly, often at a loss. One evening, I found myself standing in the hallway at 3 a.m, having walked there without fully waking, drawn by sounds I couldn't quite remember hearing. The house was alive around me with its usual symphony, creaking wood, moaning pipes, the whisper of drafts through invisible cracks. But now I heard patterns in the chaos, recognized rhythms in what I'd previously dismissed as random noise. The footsteps weren't footsteps. They were the sound of wood contracting in a specific sequence, a pattern repeated every night when the temperature dropped. The breathing in the pipes was air trapped in the system, compressed and released by changes in water pressure. The drafts followed the natural convection currents of the house, rising along warm walls, falling at cold windows, creating circulation that felt purposeful but was merely physics. I understood it all suddenly, completely. Every sound had a rational explanation. Every shadow was a trick of angles and light. The house wasn't haunted. It was just old, just settling, just being what it was. A structure of wood and metal and stone responding to temperature and time and gravity. The relief lasted less than a minute. Because understanding didn't stop the sounds, knowledge didn't prevent the drafts from circling me like sharks. Rational explanations didn't keep the reflections from moving independently in mirrors I'd removed. I could know why the house made these sounds, could trace every creak to a specific board, every moan to a particular pipe. But the knowing changed nothing. The house still performed its nightly ritual, still walked its halls, still breathed through its walls. And I began to wonder if perhaps the house had learned something during its century of settling, if by perfectly mimicking human presence for so long, it had somehow become that presence. Not haunted by ghosts, but by its own echoes, by the accumulated weight of everyone who'd ever walked these floors, slept in these rooms, listened in the darkness to sounds that might be natural or might be something else. I found myself talking to the house, quietly, under my breath, acknowledging its sounds as if responding to questions. When the floorboards groaned in the hallway, I would murmur that I heard it, that I understood. When the pipes began their breathing, I assured them, whatever, that I knew they were just settling, just doing what old pipes do. But sometimes, in those deep hours after midnight when the boundary between sleeping and waking blurs, I would hear something that didn't fit the patterns. A sound that came from no identifiable source, that followed no rhythm I'd learned. A voice, perhaps, or something like a voice. Words formed from creaking wood and moaning metal. Syllables shaped by drafts moving through empty rooms. The house was telling me something, or I was losing my mind. Or there was no difference between the two. I've stopped trying to decide which is true. I still live here, have been here for 3 months now. The sounds continue. The drafts circle. The reflections move in mirrors that no longer hang on the walls. I've learned to sleep through most of it, to tune out the nightly performance, to accept the house's presence as I would accept a roommate who keeps odd hours. But sometimes I wake at 3:17 to the sound of footsteps in the hall, and I lie in the darkness, listening as they approach my door, as they stop just beyond the threshold, as something on the other side waits with infinite patience for me to acknowledge it. And I wonder if the house is settling, or if I am, shifting and adjusting to fit its parameters, learning its language, becoming part of its structure. The landlord was right. Old places do talk to you. The question is whether you're hearing the house, or whether the house has simply learned to project your own thoughts back at you, amplifying your fears until you can't tell what comes from within and what comes from without. I'll probably stay another month, maybe 2. The rent is still cheap, and I'm getting used to the sounds. I barely notice the drafts anymore. The mirror I hung last week is already starting to tilt forward, but I've stopped adjusting it. Let it hang however it wants. Let the house arrange things as it prefers. After all, I'm just settling in. We both are. Story 9A. The basement door was open when I woke up. I'd locked it the night before. I was certain of that. The old brass deadbolt had required both hands to turn, metal grinding against metal with a resistance that spoke of decades without oil. I remembered the sound it made, remembered testing the handle twice before heading upstairs to bed. Yet there it stood in the gray morning light, ajar by perhaps 6 inches, a wedge of darkness visible beyond the frame. The rental house had seemed perfect when I'd signed the lease 3 weeks ago. Victorian architecture, hardwood floors throughout, and rent far below market value for the neighborhood. The landlord had explained the price away easily enough. The previous tenant had left abruptly, breaking their lease, and he needed someone reliable to fill the space quickly. I'd been searching for months, burned by overpriced apartments and aggressive roommate situations. The house's age didn't bother me. The isolation felt like a gift. Now, standing at the top of the basement stairs in my boxers and t-shirt, I wasn't so sure. I descended slowly, one hand trailing along the wallpaper, a faded floral pattern that had probably last been fashionable in the 50s. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, each step announcing my presence to whatever lay below. The basement unfolded in stages as I descended. First the concrete floor, then the ancient furnace squatting in the corner like a cast-iron beast, then the walls with their water stains and efflorescence blooming like pale fungi. Nothing seemed disturbed. The few boxes I'd stored down there sat exactly where I'd left them, covered in a fine layer of dust that my footprints from the previous day hadn't touched. I checked the door's locking mechanism, ran my fingers over the bolt. It showed no signs of tampering, no scratches or marks that would suggest forced entry. The lock worked smoothly when I tested it. I went back upstairs, made coffee, told myself I'd simply forgotten to lock it. The mind plays tricks, especially in a new place. I'd been working long hours at the office, staying up too late unpacking boxes, adjusting to the peculiar sounds old houses make as they settle. It was natural to be forgetful, but I knew I'd locked it. I could see myself doing it, could recall the exact sensation of the bolt sliding home. The headaches started that afternoon. They came in waves, a dull pressure that built behind my eyes and radiated backward into my skull. I took aspirin, drank water, assumed it was the stress of the move catching up with me. By evening, the pain had faded to a manageable throb, and I busied myself arranging books on the built-in shelves in the living room. That's when I noticed the photographs. They were old, pre-war, judging by the clothing and the sepia tones, and they'd been slipped between the pages of a book I'd just unpacked. I had no memory of putting them there. 3 photographs, each showing the same woman in different poses. In one, she stood before the house, my house, her expression serious and unsmiling. In another, she sat in what I recognized as the living room, though the furniture was different, heavier. The third showed her in profile, her face turned toward something outside the frame, her mouth slightly open as if she'd been caught mid-sentence. I studied her features in the failing light. There was something familiar about her, though I couldn't place why. The shape of her jaw, perhaps, or the way she held her shoulders. I felt certain I'd seen her before, though that was impossible. These photographs had to be 70, 80 years old. I set them on the mantel, intending to ask the landlord about them next time he stopped by. That night, I woke to footsteps. They came from directly above my bedroom, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth across what I knew to be empty space. The house had no second floor, just the peaked attic, accessible only through a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling. I'd checked it once when I'd first moved in, found nothing but insulation and the skeletal framework of the roof. The footsteps continued for perhaps 2 minutes, then stopped. I lay rigid in bed, covers pulled to my chin, listening to the profound silence that followed. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wanted to investigate, wanted to prove to myself there was a rational explanation. Settling floorboards, thermal expansion, something mundane and architectural, but I couldn't make myself move. Eventually, I slept. Morning brought no clarity. In the light of day, the sounds seemed less certain, more easily explained. Old houses were full of noises, pipes expanding and contracting, wood swelling with humidity. I'd grown up in a modern apartment complex. I simply wasn't accustomed to the vocabulary of aged construction, but the headaches were worse. They arrived earlier now, persisting through the morning despite medication. I found myself losing track of time, staring at my computer screen at work without processing the words in front of me. Twice, colleagues asked if I was feeling all right. I assured them I was fine, just adjusting to the new place, not sleeping well. The truth was more complicated. I was sleeping, deeply and dreamlessly, but I woke exhausted, and there were gaps in my memory, small absences that bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I couldn't remember the drive to work that morning. I found a coffee cup in the sink that I had no recollection of using. Small things, easily dismissed, but they accumulated. The woman from the photographs appeared in my peripheral vision on the fourth night. I was reading in the living room, the house quiet, except for the ticking of the radiator, when movement drew my eye toward the hallway. She stood there, or seemed to stand there, a figure in dark clothing, motionless, watching me. When I turned my head to look directly, she was gone. Nothing but shadow in the empty hallway stretching back toward the bedrooms. My hands trembled as I lowered the book. I forced myself to stand, to walk through the house, turning on every light, checking every room. Nothing. No one. The doors and windows were locked. I was alone. But I didn't feel alone. The sensation of being observed intensified over the following days. It followed me from room to room, a prickle at the back of my neck, a certainty that if I turned quickly enough, I would catch someone, something, in the act of watching. I began talking to myself, filling the silence with my own voice as a kind of ward against the oppressive quiet. The headaches became constant. I existed in a haze of pain, popping aspirin like candy, squinting against the light. My appetite vanished. Food tasted strange, metallic and wrong. I lost weight. The mirror showed a stranger's face, hollow-eyed, pale, with a tightness around the mouth that hadn't been there before. And the woman was everywhere, not just in photographs now, but in glimpses, standing at the end of the hallway, sitting in the chair by the window, climbing the basement stairs. Each sighting lasted only a moment, vanishing the instant I focused on it, but they were undeniable. I tried to convince myself they were tricks of light, fatigue, stress, the brain filling in patterns where none existed. But the consistency bothered me. Always the same woman, always the same expression of patient observation. I stopped inviting friends over. The one time someone visited, they'd asked if I was sure I was all right, told me I looked sick, suggested I see a doctor. Their concern had felt intrusive, accusatory. After they left, I'd found myself unable to remember most of our conversation. Whole blocks of dialogue simply missing from my recollection. The basement door continued to open. Every morning, without fail, I would find it standing ajar. I experimented with different locks, added a chain, even went so far as to nail boards across the frame. Nothing worked. Each morning brought the same result. The door open, the darkness beyond beckoning. I stopped going down there. Whatever was in the basement could stay there, but the sounds that came from below couldn't be ignored. Scratching, tapping, sometimes what sounded like furniture being dragged across concrete. I stood at the top of the stairs at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, listening to the unmistakable sounds of activity in a space I knew was empty. The rational part of my mind screamed explanations. Animals in the walls, settling foundation, pipes and heating systems. The rest of me knew better. The woman spoke to me for the first time on a Tuesday. I was in the kitchen staring at the refrigerator without knowing why I'd opened it, when her voice came from behind me, low and clear, speaking words I couldn't quite understand. I spun around, heart lurching, to find the kitchen empty, but the voice continued, coming from the living room now, reciting something in a monotone that raised the hair on my arms. I walked toward it like a man in a dream. The living room was dim, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. The voice seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, words bleeding together into a stream of sound that made no sense but felt urgently important. I tried to focus, to parse individual syllables, but my mind refused to cooperate. The headache bloomed behind my eyes with renewed vigor. Then I saw her, really saw her, standing beside the mantel where I'd placed her photographs. She looked exactly as she had in the pictures. Dark dress, serious expression, hands folded at her waist. But now she was three-dimensional, solid, casting no shadow, but undeniably present. She turned her head to look at me, and I recognized her. The recognition came not from memory, but from somewhere deeper, a visceral certainty that existed below conscious thought. I knew her face the way you know your own reflection, knew the particular set of her shoulders, the angle of her chin, but I'd never met her. That was impossible. She'd been dead for decades before I was born. She opened her mouth to speak, and I woke up on the floor. The living room was dark now, full night having fallen while I'd been unconscious. My body ached from lying on the hardwood, and my head pounded with a ferocity that made me nauseous. I pulled myself upright, using the couch for support, and noticed the photographs on the mantel. They seemed different somehow, though I couldn't articulate the change. The woman in the images looked less like a stranger, more like something remembered. I called in sick the next day, then the day after that. I stopped answering my phone, let emails pile up unread. The house demanded all my attention. I wandered from room to room, losing hours, finding myself in places with no memory of having walked there. The basement door stood permanently open now, and strange smells drifted up from below, earthy and chemical at once, like rust and decay. The woman was no longer trying to hide. She moved through the house openly, her presence as commonplace as furniture. I grew accustomed to seeing her in doorways, sitting in chairs, standing at windows. Sometimes she seemed aware of me, turning to watch as I passed. Other times she appeared lost in her own world, going through motions I couldn't decipher, interacting with objects I couldn't see. I tried to leave once, got as far as the front door, keys in hand, overnight bag packed. But when I reached for the doorknob, I hesitated. Something wasn't right. The world beyond the door seemed distant, unreal, like a photograph instead of a place. Inside the house felt more solid, more true. I put down the bag, hung the keys back on their hook, and returned to the living room where the woman waited. She was smiling now. That was new. The headaches had evolved into something else entirely, a persistent disorientation that made it difficult to distinguish past from present, memory from experience. I found myself recalling conversations I'd never had, remembering rooms I'd never been in. The house was changing, or I was changing, or both. Walls seemed to shift position when I wasn't looking. Furniture I'd arranged myself appeared in different configurations. One morning, or was it evening, I discovered I couldn't remember my own address. Couldn't remember how long I'd lived here. Couldn't remember what had come before. There had been something else, some other life, but it slipped away when I tried to focus on it, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The woman sat across from me in the living room. She'd been talking for hours or minutes, telling me something important. I couldn't understand the words, but I nodded along anyway, feeling the truth of what she said resonating in my bones. The photographs on the mantel had multiplied, dozens of them now, maybe hundreds, covering every surface, all showing the same woman. And in the newer ones, when had those appeared? I saw myself, standing beside her, both of us in front of the house, both of us unsmiling, both of us looking into the camera with the same patient expression. I picked up one of the photographs, studied the man standing next to the woman. He wore clothes from another era, his hair styled in an old-fashioned way, but his face was mine, unmistakably mine. The photograph was old, the paper yellowed with age, the image fading at the edges, but I was in it. The basement called to me then, its door standing wide, darkness beckoning. I rose without deciding to, walked without choosing my direction. The woman followed, or perhaps led. It was hard to tell anymore where she ended and I began. At the top of the stairs I paused, looking down into the darkness below. The smell was stronger here, that strange combination of earth and metal, and something else, something sharp that made my eyes water. The headache pulsed in time with my heartbeat, a rhythm that felt ancient and inevitable. The furnace groaned in the corner, its old mechanisms clicking and hissing. Such an old system, probably original to the house. The landlord had mentioned something about it when I'd signed the lease, some detail I couldn't quite recall. Something about maintenance, about checking it regularly, about the importance of proper ventilation. I descended into the darkness, and the woman's hand found mine. Her skin was cool and familiar. Behind us, the door remained open, as it always had, as it always would. The house settled around us with a sound like contentment, like recognition, like coming home. And somewhere, in a part of my mind growing smaller by the moment, I wondered if I'd ever really left. Story 10. The first time it happened, I blamed the medication. Dr. Chen had prescribed something new for my insomnia, a small blue pill that promised dreamless sleep. I'd been averaging 3 hours a night for months, my mind grinding through spreadsheets and quarterly reports, even as I lay horizontal in the dark. The exhaustion had become physical, a heaviness that settled into my bones like sediment. That first night, I woke, or thought I woke, to find myself frozen. My eyes were open. The ceiling fan rotated in slow, hypnotic circles above me, its shadow blades cutting through the amber glow of the streetlight that always leaked through my bedroom curtains. I could see everything with perfect clarity. The pile of laundry on the chair, the red digits of my alarm clock reading 3:17 a.m., the way the walls seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the building's old heating system. But I couldn't move. Not my arms, not my legs, not even my fingers. The paralysis was absolute, as if my body had become a shell and I was trapped inside it, screaming at muscles that refused to respond. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, the only part of me that still functioned, and even that felt constrained, as though something was pressing down on my chest. Then I saw it, a shape in the corner, darker than the surrounding shadows, impossibly still. It stood beside my dresser, where the darkness pooled deepest, and though I couldn't make out any features, I knew, with the certainty that only comes in nightmares, that it was watching me. The pressure on my chest increased. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat so violent I thought my sternum might crack. I tried to scream, tried to move, tried to do anything except lie there and feel the weight of that unseen gaze crawling across my skin like insects. The shadow didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was suffocating. Then, like a switch being flipped, my body unlocked. I gasped, jerking upright so fast I nearly fell out of bed, my hands clutching at the sheets as if they could anchor me to reality. The corner was empty. Just my dresser, my mirror, the familiar geography of my bedroom rendered harmless by the sudden return of movement. Sleep paralysis, I learned the next morning, is a documented phenomenon. The brain wakes up before the body does, leaving you conscious but immobilized. The hallucinations, the shadows, the presences, the sense of malevolent watching, are just misfires in the temporal lobe, meaningless static generated by a brain caught between sleep and waking. Dr. Chen seemed unconcerned when I called. He mentioned adjusting my dosage, asked if I'd been under unusual stress, suggested I keep a sleep journal. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe in misfiring neurons and chemical imbalances and the rational explanations that made the world make sense. But it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Each time, the pattern was the same. I would surface into consciousness at 3:17 a.m., trapped in my paralyzed body, while that shape stood in the corner and watched. Sometimes it was beside the dresser. Sometimes it stood at the foot of my bed. Once, I woke to find it leaning over me, so close I could feel the cold radiating from it, though I still couldn't see anything except that absence of light shaped roughly like a person. The pressure on my chest grew worse each night. It felt intentional now, as if invisible hands were pushing down on my ribcage, testing how much weight I could bear before something inside me broke. My breathing became more labored, my panic more acute. The seconds stretched into eternities while I lay there, unable to move, unable to look away from that watching darkness. I stopped taking the medication. The paralysis continued. I tried sleeping at different times, in different positions, with the lights on. Nothing changed. 3:17 a.m. would arrive, and I would wake into that prison of my own flesh, while the shadow kept its vigil. The lack of sleep began to erode me. My performance at work deteriorated. I would find myself staring at my computer screen, the numbers meaningless, my mind replaying the sensation of being watched. My colleagues noticed. My boss mentioned concern. I told them I was dealing with some medical issues, which was true in a sense, though I didn't mention the part about the thing that visited me every night. During the day, I researched obsessively. I read medical journals about sleep disorders, anthropological studies about the folklore of night terrors, forum posts from other sufferers describing their own experiences with shadow people. The stories were disturbingly similar. Always the paralysis, always the presence, always the sense of malevolent intent. Some people reported years of episodes. Some said they learned to recognize the onset and could sometimes break free faster. Others claimed the entities became more aggressive over time. That last detail stayed with me. I began to notice things during the episodes that I hadn't registered before. The shadow wasn't entirely formless. There were suggestions of shape within it, angles and curves that almost resolved into something recognizable before my mind slid away from them. And it was growing bolder. The distance between us shrank each night. The first time it appeared, it had been across the room. Now it was close enough that I could sense its dimensions, the way it displaced the air, the particular quality of cold that emanated from wherever it stood. I consulted other doctors. A neurologist ordered scans and found nothing wrong. A sleep specialist suggested cognitive behavioral therapy and recommended I stop researching the phenomenon, as my anxiety was likely exacerbating the symptoms. A psychiatrist asked gentle questions about my childhood and prescribed an anti-anxiety medication I never filled. None of them could explain why it was always 3:17 a.m. None of them could explain the consistency of the hallucination. The same figure, the same behavior, the same mounting sense of purpose in its watching. I started sleeping with my phone in my hand, recording video through the night. Every morning, I would review the footage, watching myself lie motionless for hours before jerking awake at exactly 3:17, my face contorted in silent terror. The corner remained empty in every frame. The dresser stood alone. There was never anything there except shadows and furniture. But I could feel it watching. Even in the recordings, I could see the moment when its attention fixed on me. The way my body tensed. The way my breathing changed from the slow rhythm of sleep to the rapid, panicked gasps of prey that knows it's being hunted. 3 weeks in, I started leaving my apartment at night. I would set an alarm for 3 a.m., drag myself out of bed while I still could, and drive aimlessly until dawn. I visited all-night diners, parked in empty lots, wandered the fluorescent aisles of 24-hour supermarkets. As long as I wasn't in my bed at 3:17, I was safe. But exhaustion is its own trap. I fell asleep at my desk one afternoon, my head pillowed on my arms during what was supposed to be a 15-minute break. I surfaced into consciousness at 3:17 p.m., though the clock on my computer screen read 2:47, the wrongness of the time made my skin crawl. To find my body locked, my breath strangled, and that familiar dark shape standing beside my office door. It had found me, even awake, even away from my apartment, even in the wrong time zone of afternoon instead of the dead of night. It had found me. I managed to move after what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. My coworkers hadn't noticed anything strange. I'd just been sleeping at my desk, they said later. No one saw me struggle. No one heard me trying to scream. That night, I didn't go home. I checked into a hotel across town, choosing a room on the top floor with bright lights and thin walls where I could hear other guests moving around. I kept the television on, the volume up, filling the space with noise and light and the artificial presence of other people. At 3:17 a.m., I woke in the hotel bed, paralyzed. The shadow stood at the window, backlit by the city lights, and for the first time I could see details. Not features, never features, but the outline was unmistakable now. Tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that bent at angles that hurt to look at. It didn't move, but I had the sense that it was pleased, that it had been testing me, measuring my responses, and I had failed some crucial examination. The pressure on my chest was enormous now. Something was crushing me, driving the air from my lungs, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't fight, Couldn't do anything except lie there and feel my heart trying to beat its way out of my rib cage. The edges of my vision started to darken. True darkness. Not the shadow darkness of the figure, but the encroaching black of oxygen deprivation. Then it was over. My body unlocked. I gasped, rolled onto my side, and vomited onto the hotel carpet, my body purging the adrenaline and terror in the only way it knew how. I didn't sleep again that night, or the next. I drank coffee, took stimulants I'd bought from a guy in my building, did everything I could to stay conscious. But you can't outrun sleep forever. Eventually, biology wins. When I finally collapsed, it was in the middle of the afternoon in my living room. I woke, of course I woke, at 3:17. The clock on the wall confirmed it, though the light streaming through my windows insisted it was midday. Time had become meaningless. Day and night were just different flavors of the same trap. The shadow stood directly in front of me now, close enough that I could have touched it if I could have moved, close enough that the cold radiating from it made my exposed skin ache, close enough that I could see, or thought I could see, what might have been eyes in the formless dark of its head. And for the first time it moved. Not much, just a slight inclination, as if it was leaning down to examine me more closely. The pressure on my chest intensified until I thought my ribs would splinter. My vision tunneled. My heartbeat was a drum in my ears, irregular and panicked. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't do anything except exist in that moment of frozen terror. Then my body released. I jerked upright, scrambling backward until I hit the wall, my breath coming in ragged sobs. The living room was empty. Sunlight warmed the floor. Outside I could hear traffic, people talking, the normal sounds of a normal afternoon in a normal city. But something had changed. I could feel it the way you feel a fever coming on. That deep body knowledge that something is wrong even before the symptoms manifest. The shadow was still with me, not visible, not present in any way I could point to, but there, watching, waiting. I haven't slept in my apartment since then. I've tried friends' couches, other hotels, my car parked in busy lots. It doesn't matter. Every time I lose consciousness, I wake at 3:17. Whether that's AM or PM seems to make no difference anymore, to find myself frozen and observed. The doctors can't help me. The medication doesn't work. The rational explanations feel increasingly hollow when you're lying paralyzed for the dozenth time, feeling that cold presence growing closer, more solid, more real with each episode. Last night, I felt it touch me. Just a brush of something against my forehead, light as a falling feather but cold enough to burn. My body was locked, my scream trapped in my throat, while that shadow hand, because it was a hand, I could sense the individual fingers despite seeing nothing, traced a line down my face, my neck, pressed against my chest where the weight always centered. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what it is. The rational part of my mind insists it's still just hallucinations, just my oxygen-starved brain creating meaning from random neural firing. But that part is getting quieter, drowned out by the growing certainty that something is sharing my nights, something that has been studying me with increasing interest, something that might be done watching. It's 3:12 a.m. now. I'm writing this in a coffee shop surrounded by students cramming for exams and shift workers grabbing caffeine before dawn. The lights are bright. The espresso machine hisses. Someone laughs at a video on their phone. Everything is aggressively, artificially normal, but I can feel my eyes getting heavy. I can feel sleep pulling at me with the inexorable weight of gravity. And I know, with the same certainty that I know the sun will rise, that I know my own name, that in 5 minutes, I'll wake up paralyzed, wherever I am, whatever I'm doing. And this time, I don't think it's going to just watch. The clock on the wall reads 3:16. I should have stayed awake. Story 11. I should have left the moment I found the newspaper clippings. The real estate agent had been too eager. Her smile stretched thin across her face like plastic wrap. The price was criminally low for a 3-bedroom colonial in this neighborhood. Hardwood floors, original crown molding, a backyard that sprawled into darkness beneath ancient oaks. I'd asked why it had been on the market for so long. She'd said something about the previous owner's estate taking time to settle. Her eyes had darted to the left when she spoke. I signed the papers on a Thursday. The clippings fell out of a heating vent 3 weeks later, while I was replacing the filter. Yellow, brittle, dated 15 years back. The headline screamed in bold typeface. Local teacher found unresponsive. Investigators cite prolonged suffering. Neighbors report hearing nothing for days. The articles described how Evelyn Hartwell, a 62-year-old English teacher, had spent her final week in this house, incapacitated by a stroke, unable to call for help, slowly fading in the upstairs bedroom. My bedroom now. The paper crumbled between my fingers, releasing a smell like burnt dust and something sweeter, something organic and wrong. I read every word twice, my eyes catching on phrases. Extreme distress. Evidence suggests awareness until the end. Claw marks on the bed frame. The last detail made my stomach twist. That night, the house felt different. The same walls, the same creaking floorboards I'd grown accustomed to, but now they seemed to lean inward, watching. The rational part of my brain understood what was happening. I'd poisoned my own perception with information. Knowing what occurred here had transformed neutral space into something sinister. The shadows in the corners were just shadows. The temperature drop in the hallway was just poor insulation. The faint smell that occasionally drifted through the bedroom was just old wood and dust. Except the smell was wrong. It came in waves, usually around 3 in the morning, pulling me from sleep like a hand on my shoulder. Sweet and putrid simultaneously, like flowers left too long in standing water. I'd wake with my heart hammering, convinced someone was standing beside the bed. The room would be empty, always empty, but the scent lingered. I bought air fresheners, checked for dead animals in the walls, hired an HVAC specialist who found nothing. He'd stood in my bedroom, his equipment detecting only normal air circulation, and looked at me with something between pity and suspicion. The sound started a week later. Footsteps, soft and shuffling, moving across the upstairs hallway. I'd freeze wherever I was in the house, listening to that distinctive drag step pattern, like someone struggling to walk. They'd pause outside bedroom doors, linger for seconds that stretched into eternities, then continue. I'd investigate immediately, every single time, finding nothing but still air and empty space. Once, I climbed the stairs fast enough that no one could have hidden, certain I'd catch whoever was there. The hallway was vacant, but the runner rug at the top of the stairs was bunched up, pushed aside as if something had caught on it. I began researching, which was my first real mistake. The internet provided too much information. Forums dedicated to the house's history, Reddit threads speculating about what happened, blog posts from previous renters who'd left abruptly. They described similar experiences. The smell, the footsteps, the overwhelming sensation of being watched. But more than that, they described the progression. How it started small and grew. How the presence, whatever it was, seemed to feed on attention. How the worst experiences came to those who knew the full story. Confirmation bias, I told myself. These people had read about each other's experiences and convinced themselves they'd had similar ones. A feedback loop of suggestion and expectation. The human brain is exceptional at finding patterns, even where none exist, especially in the dark, especially in houses that creak and settle with age. But then I started seeing things. Not clearly, never clearly. Peripheral motion that vanished when I turned my head. A shape at the top of the stairs that dissolved into shadow and banister when I looked directly at it. The bathroom mirror fogging in patterns that almost resembled handprints. Almost. I could always explain it away. The mirror was just condensation. The movement was just my eyes adjusting to different light levels. The shapes were just the architecture playing tricks. Yet the explanations felt increasingly hollow. I began documenting everything with my phone, trying to catch evidence. Hours of footage showing empty rooms and silent hallways. I'd watch it back, frame by frame, searching for anomalies. Sometimes I found them, slight distortions in the video, audio pops that sounded almost like breathing, shadows that seemed fractionally darker than they should be. But were these genuine phenomena or artifacts of cheap phone cameras and desperate interpretation? I couldn't tell anymore. The truly disturbing part was realizing I'd changed my behavior without conscious decision. I avoided the upstairs hallway after dark. I left lights on in rooms I wasn't using. I'd catch myself holding my breath while walking past the bedroom, as if making noise would attract attention. These weren't choices born from genuine experience. They were the product of contaminated expectation. I'd read about a woman dying slowly in that room, and now every shadow there felt predatory. Or maybe the shadows really were different. 3 months in, I found myself standing outside the bedroom at 3:47 a.m., drawn by sounds I couldn't quite identify. Not footsteps this time. Something else. A wet, labored breathing, interrupted by long gaps of silence. The kind of breathing that comes when lungs are struggling, when the body is failing. I pressed my ear against the door, my own breath held so tightly my chest ached. The sound stopped. For 5 heartbeats, there was nothing. Then I heard it, right on the other side of the door, inches from my face, a long rattling exhale. The door was thin wood. Whatever was there, I could have reached through and touched it. Should have. Could have proven to myself it was nothing, just pipes or wind or the house settling. My hand was on the doorknob. All I had to do was turn it. I went downstairs instead and slept on the couch until sunrise. The next day I called the real estate agent, got her voicemail, left a message asking about the house's history, trying to keep my voice steady. She never called back. I tried the number 3 more times over the following week, always reaching voicemail, never receiving a response. I drove to her office downtown, but the receptionist informed me she no longer worked there. Had left rather suddenly, actually. Forwarding information? They couldn't provide any, privacy policies and such. I started spending time at the local library, digging through old records, found more articles about Evelyn Hartwell. She'd been beloved by students, dedicated to her work, lived alone after her husband left years prior. The stroke had been massive, leaving her conscious but paralyzed. The coroner's report, public record, thanks to the investigation into why no one had checked on her, suggested she'd remained aware for most of that final week. The bedroom showed signs of attempts to move, to reach the phone on the nightstand. She'd gotten close, 3 inches away when she finally stopped trying. Reading those details changed something fundamental. The house felt different when I returned that evening, heavier somehow, as if the walls had absorbed my newfound knowledge and were pressing it back against me. The upstairs hallway seemed longer. The bedroom door stood slightly ajar, though I always kept it closed. Beyond it, darkness pooled thick and absolute. I should have left then. Should have abandoned my security deposit, my furniture, my pride. Should have acknowledged that living here was destroying something in me, regardless of whether ghosts were real or my mind was eating itself with suggestion and fear. Instead, I went upstairs. The bedroom was cold, far colder than any other room in the house. My breath misted in the air. The smell was overwhelming now, that sweet rot, impossible to ignore or rationalize away. And beneath it, something else, copper, like old blood or fear sweat. The bed frame still bore marks from Evelyn's fingers, gouges in the wood where she'd tried to drag herself toward help. I'd never noticed them before, but now, in the dim light from the hallway, they were unmistakable. I walked to the nightstand, 3 inches from the bed. She'd died reaching for this exact spot. My phone sat there, plugged into the charger. I stared at it. This connection to the outside world, to help, to rescue, 3 inches. Such a small distance. To her, it must have been infinite. The presence arrived without sound or movement, simply filling the room like water flooding a sealed container. I felt it behind me, impossible to see, impossible to ignore. The weight of its attention pressed against my back, my neck, the base of my skull. Every instinct screamed to turn around, to face it, to confirm what I already knew was there. But I understood, with absolute crystalline certainty, that turning would be a mistake. That some things, once seen directly, couldn't be unseen. That acknowledgement was permission. The moment I validated its existence with my eyes would be the moment it became fully real. The moment suggestion transformed into genuine haunting. Or perhaps it was already real, and I was the one who wasn't. Perhaps I'd been here much longer than I believed. Perhaps the newspaper clippings had fallen out of that vent years ago, decades ago, and I'd simply been repeating the same patterns, reading the same articles, experiencing the same progression that every tenant before me had experienced. The house teaching us all the same lesson about knowledge and perception and the terrible weight of knowing what happened in a place. The breathing started again behind me, wet and struggling, 3 inches away, right where the bed was, where she'd been. I picked up my phone with steady hands. The screen showed 3:47 a.m. Of course it did. It was always 3:47 a.m. in this room. I could scroll through my camera roll and find dozens of photos taken at this exact time, in this exact spot. Me standing at this nightstand with that presence behind me. I'd done this before, would do it again. The realtor had been right to stop answering my calls. She'd lived in this house once too, I was certain now, had found her own newspaper clippings, read her own articles, felt her own presence. That's why she'd left her job. You can't sell houses after you understand what homes really are. Containers for memory, amplifiers of expectation, mirrors reflecting back our deepest fears dressed in the clothes of the previous tenant's suffering. I still haven't turned around. I'm writing this now, my back to the room, that breathing growing louder with each word. The smell is suffocating. I can feel something touching my shoulder, light as a moth, insistent as a drowning person's grip. The logical explanation is that I'm experiencing a psychotic break, that the stress of living here has fractured something in my mind, that everything I'm feeling is neural misfiring and suggestion and the power of autosuggestion. The other explanation is that she never left. That consciousness, when it ends in extreme distress, leaves something behind. An echo. A remnant. Something that remembers reaching for help that never came, that remembers being 3 inches from salvation, that remembers the terrible awareness that comes with dying slowly and alone. I don't know which explanation is true. What terrifies me most is that it might not matter. That whether this is genuine haunting or elaborate delusion, the result is the same. I'm trapped in this bedroom at 3:47 a.m., feeling something behind me that shouldn't exist, writing words that may never be read. 3 inches from safety I can't seem to reach. The breathing has stopped. In its place I hear something worse. The soft sound of fingernails on wood, scratch, scratch, scratching, like someone trying desperately to move, to get away, to reach just a little bit farther. The sound is coming from the bed frame, or from inside my head, or from somewhere in between. That space where knowledge and perception meet and create something neither wholly real nor wholly imagined. I should turn around, should face whatever this is, should prove to myself that I'm either haunted or insane. That reality is one thing or the other, but I'm afraid of what I'll see. Not the presence itself, if it exists, but the expression on its face. Because I'm terrified it will be my own face looking back at me, 15 years older, still standing at this nightstand, still trying to understand what's real, still 3 inches from freedom I can no longer remember how to reach. The scratching continues. I think it's coming from both of us now. Story 12. The thermometer read 103. 4 when I last checked, but that was hours ago, or maybe minutes. Time had become elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made my stomach turn. The heat wave had turned my rented cottage into a kiln, and somewhere between the third sleepless night and the moment I'd stopped being able to keep water down, something fundamental had shifted in the house around me. I'd come here to finish my dissertation. 3 months of solitude in the Blue Ridge foothills seemed perfect for uninterrupted work. The property manager, an older gentleman with weathered hands and a cautious smile, had mentioned the house's history only in passing. Something about it standing empty for years, about previous tenants leaving earlier than planned. I'd signed the papers anyway. The rent was too good to pass up. That was before the heat arrived, before my body betrayed me. The illness had started subtly, a scratchy throat, a vague sense of exhaustion that I'd attributed to long hours bent over research. Then came the fever, climbing steadily as the outside temperature soared into the triple digits. The cottage had no air conditioning, just a rattling box fan in the bedroom window that pushed hot air in lazy circles. I'd meant to drive into town for medicine, for electrolyte drinks, for anything. But the fever had spiked so quickly that standing became an ordeal, and the 20-mile drive seemed impossible. So I stayed, alone, sweating through sheets that felt like sandpaper against my skin. The sound started on the second night of high fever. At first, I convinced myself it was the house settling, the old wood expanding and contracting in the heat. But the footsteps, and they were footsteps, I was certain, followed patterns too deliberate to be random. They moved through the hallway outside my bedroom door, paused, then retreated toward the kitchen. The rhythm was wrong for floorboards cooling in the evening air. There was weight to them, purpose. I forced myself to investigate during a moment of relative clarity, my legs trembling as I gripped the doorframe for support. The hallway stretched before me, longer than I remembered, the walls seeming to breathe in the dim light filtering through dusty windows. Empty. Of course it was empty. The footsteps had stopped the moment I opened the door, as if whatever made them was waiting just around the corner, holding perfectly still. My mouth tasted like copper and ash. I needed water desperately, but the thought of crossing that hallway to reach the kitchen filled me with a dread I couldn't rationalize. Instead, I retreated to bed, pulled the sweat-soaked sheets to my chin despite the heat, and tried to ignore the way shadows pooled in the corner of the ceiling, defying the geometry of the single lamp I'd left burning. Sleep came in fragments, fever dreams that bled into waking hallucinations until I couldn't distinguish between them. In one, I stood in the cottage's small living room, watching a figure arrange books on the shelf. My books, the ones I'd brought for research. The figure's back was turned, and though I couldn't see their face, I knew with absolute certainty that I shouldn't let them turn around, that something terrible would happen if our eyes met. I woke gasping, or thought I did. The books on my bedside table were arranged differently than I'd left them. Alphabetically now, when I'd stacked them by topic. My fever-dulled mind struggled to explain this, landed on sleepwalking, on doing it myself and forgetting. But my body felt too heavy, too weak to have moved at all. The third night, I think it was the third night, the presence became undeniable. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to focus on the rotating fan blades to anchor myself to something real. The house had gone quiet, except for the fan's mechanical whir and the settling sounds that came at irregular intervals. Then I felt it, the distinct sensation of being watched, not the paranoid feeling of isolation, but the physical awareness of another consciousness focused intently on me. My eyes slid toward the corner of the room, the one where shadows accumulated too thickly. In my peripheral vision, something stood there, tall, very tall. The moment I tried to look directly at it, it wasn't there, just the play of darkness and the old armchair I'd shoved against the wall. But the presence remained, patient and attentive. My heart hammered against my ribs. The fever made everything feel viscous, my thoughts moving through syrup. Was this real? Was I actually seeing something? Or had my overheated brain conjured a phantom from dehydration and exhaustion? I tried to speak, to demand identification from whatever shared my room, but my throat was too dry, my tongue too swollen. The thing in the corner, if there was a thing, didn't move. It simply observed, waiting. I must have passed out again because when awareness returned, weak daylight struggled through the curtains. My sheets were soaked through completely, and my fever had climbed higher. The thermometer read 104. 2. I knew distantly that this was dangerous, that I should call someone, but my phone was in the kitchen. Had I left it in the kitchen? And the hallway still felt wrong. Too long, too watchful. Instead, I dragged myself to the bathroom adjacent to the bedroom, drank handfuls of metallic-tasting water from the tap. and splashed my face. The mirror showed a stranger, hollow-eyed, skin flushed and unhealthy red, lips cracked and pale. Behind my reflection, the shower curtain hung perfectly still. Nothing moved. Yet the certainty that I wasn't alone pressed against my awareness like a hand on the back of my neck. Something had changed in the house's atmosphere. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe, as if the space itself had become congested. Every surface seemed to pulse faintly in rhythm with my racing heart. When I returned to bed, I noticed immediately that the books had been disturbed again. They now sat in a stack with their spines facing away from me, titles hidden. A configuration I would never have chosen. The rational part of my mind, growing smaller by the hour, insisted I'd done this myself during one of my fever fugues. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was trying to send a message. Look away. Don't read. Don't try to understand. As evening approached and the heat showed no signs of breaking, I began to hear the whispers. They came from the walls, or maybe from inside my own head. The distinction had become meaningless, sibilant and just below the threshold of comprehension, like someone speaking in a language I'd almost forgotten. The sounds rose and fell in conversation, sometimes seeming to respond to my movements. When I shifted in bed, they paused. When I grew still, they resumed. I pressed my palms against my ears, but the whispers continued, now clearly originating from somewhere beyond my skull. They seemed to emanate from the ventilation grate in the ceiling, from the gap under the bedroom door, from the walls themselves. Multiple voices now, overlapping. Were they discussing me? Deciding something? My fever thoughts turned labyrinthine. Perhaps I'd been drugged. Perhaps the property manager had put something in the water, was watching me through hidden cameras as I deteriorated. Perhaps the house had always been a trap, and I'd walked into it willingly, signing papers that bound me here. Perhaps I'd already died, and this was some intermediate state, a fever dream stretched across eternity. The logical explanations felt increasingly absurd. Fever, dehydration, exhaustion. These were medical conditions with understood mechanisms. The brain, deprived of proper function, creates phantoms, attributes agency to random stimuli. I'd studied this in my research on religious experiences, the ways altered states produce encounters that feel transcendently real while being entirely neurological in origin. But knowing the mechanism didn't stop the footsteps in the hallway, didn't stop the books from rearranging themselves, didn't stop the presence in the corner from watching, always watching, with attention that felt almost hungry. On the fourth night, I'd lost count, but I think it was 4. I woke to find myself standing in the hallway. I had no memory of leaving bed, no sensation of walking. One moment I was lying down, the next I stood in the darkness between the bedroom and kitchen, my bare feet on floorboards that felt too warm, as if something had recently passed over them. The hallway stretched impossibly long in both directions, walls breathing in and out with subtle motion that might have been heat distortion, or might have been something else entirely. Behind me, the bedroom door stood ajar. Through the gap, I could see my bed, sheets tangled and empty. Ahead, the kitchen beckoned with promises of water, of medicine, of a phone to call for help. But the darkness between here and there seemed almost solid, a physical barrier requiring more strength than I possessed. Then I heard it, breathing that wasn't my own. It came from very close, just behind my left shoulder, measured and deep. The sound of lungs much larger than human ones, drawing air with deliberate slowness. I couldn't turn around. Some animal instinct, deeper than conscious thought, screamed at me to remain absolutely still. Whatever stood behind me existed in a different category than normal danger. Looking at it would constitute an invitation, an acknowledgement that would fundamentally change the rules of engagement. I stood frozen, swaying slightly, while the breathing continued. It moved closer. I felt displaced air against my neck, warmth that shouldn't exist in this already sweltering house. The presence was examining me, I realized, studying me with the same intensity I'd felt when it watched from the corner. But now there was no distance, no safety of separation. A sound escaped my throat, something between a whimper and a prayer, and the breathing stopped. The silence that followed felt worse than any sound. It was expectant, poised, as if reality itself waited to see what would happen next. My vision began to tunnel, black spots spreading across my awareness. Was I passing out? Dying? Or was this the moment when the barrier between fevered hallucination and something else entirely dissolved completely? I woke in bed. Morning light. No memory of returning. The fever had broken slightly. I was down to 101. 6, enough for rational thought to assert itself more firmly. I'd been hallucinating, obviously. The combination of high fever, dehydration, and sleep deprivation had created a perfect storm of perceptual distortion. The human brain, that electrical meat computer, couldn't be trusted under such conditions. It filled gaps with phantoms, created narratives from noise, attributed consciousness to shadows. I forced myself to drink water, to eat a few crackers from the emergency supplies I'd brought. The act of swallowing felt like a minor victory. With some moisture back in my system and the fever slightly lower, the house seemed more normal. Just an old cottage, creaky and sun-baked. The shadows were only shadows. The sounds were only wood and wind. But the books on my nightstand had been returned to their original configuration. I stared at them, trying to remember if I'd reorganized them during one of my lucid moments. The memory wouldn't come. Instead, what surfaced was the certainty that I'd watched someone else arrange them, had seen hands, had they been hands, moving with careful precision. A dream, surely. A fever dream given false weight by my compromised mental state. I checked my phone, finally retrieved from the kitchen in a stumbling journey that left me breathless, and found that I'd lost 3 days. 3 entire days compressed into fragmented memories of footsteps and whispers and things watching from corners. The heat wave was supposed to break tonight. I could drive to town tomorrow, see a doctor, get antibiotics if needed. Just one more night. The house seemed to react to this decision. As afternoon faded into evening and my fever began to climb again, 101, 8, 102, 1, 102, 6. The familiar presence returned. But now it felt less observational, more participatory. The footsteps in the hallway moved with purpose, pacing back and forth as if preparing for something. The whispers grew more distinct, almost comprehensible, like hearing a conversation through a door that was slowly opening. I tried to tell myself it was just the fever resurging, my brain chemistry fluctuating as my body fought infection. But the explanation felt thin, inadequate to explain the weight of attention focused on me from every corner of the cottage. Something had been building during my days of delirium, some process or understanding that I'd been too sick to fully grasp. As darkness fell and the temperature finally began to drop, I became aware that I was waiting. Not for rescue or recovery, but for something else. A conclusion. A revelation. The presence had been patient, observing me as I thrashed through fever dreams and hallucinations, and now it had decided. Tonight would be different. Tonight I would understand. Or tonight I would lose myself completely to delirium. The distinction no longer seemed important. When the breathing started again, deep and measured, so close I could feel it disturb the air, I didn't panic. Instead, I found myself turning, slowly, toward the corner where shadows pooled, toward the space that should be empty, but had never felt empty, my compromised mind finally ready to see what my fever had been showing me all along. And just before I completed the turn, just before my eyes could focus on what stood waiting, I had one final moment of clarity. One last rational thought before the boundary dissolved. I couldn't remember if I'd taken any medication, if this was delirium, or if I'd somehow made it to town and back without memory of the journey. If the fever was spiking or breaking. If I'd been here for 3 days, or 3 weeks, or 3 hours. I couldn't remember if the property manager had ever really existed, or if I'd found this place some other way. I couldn't remember my own name. And as I completed the turn, as my gaze met what had been patiently waiting in the corner, patient as only a fever can be patient, or only something that exists outside of fever can be patient, I realized that the question of whether this was real or hallucination had become irrelevant, because either way I was going to see it. Either way, it had already seen me. The thermometer on my nightstand blinked in the darkness, its red numbers climbing steadily higher as the last threads of certainty finally, mercifully, snapped. Story 13. The house settled differently after she left. That's what I told myself during those first weeks, when the floorboards would creak in sequences that seemed too deliberate, too rhythmic to be random expansion and contraction. Old houses breathe, I'd read somewhere. They shift with temperature changes, with humidity, with the weight of years pressing down through rafters and joists. But this felt like something else. Something that waited until I was almost asleep before starting its nightly rounds through rooms I no longer entered. The divorce papers sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days before I could bring myself to sign them. My lawyer had called twice. The second time, I let it go to voicemail and listened to his message while staring at the water stain on the ceiling above the sink, a yellowish bloom that had been there when we moved in 5 years ago. We'd always meant to fix it. The stain had grown, spreading in fingers that reached toward the light fixture, and I found myself tracing its expansion with my eyes during those long afternoons when the house felt too large and too quiet and too full of something I couldn't name. I signed the papers on a Thursday. That night I heard footsteps on the stairs. Not the usual settling sounds. Those had become familiar, almost companionable in their predictability. These were distinct, measured, the particular cadence of someone climbing stairs with purpose. I sat up in bed, my heart performing acrobatics against my ribs, and strained to hear over the rush of blood in my ears. The footsteps stopped at the landing. I could feel the presence of someone standing just outside my bedroom door, could sense the weight of attention focused on the thin barrier of wood and empty air between us. Nothing happened. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I convinced myself it had been the house. Just the house, doing what old houses do. I didn't sleep well. The law firm let me go the following week. They called it a mutual parting of ways, used phrases like difficult period, and perhaps some time to focus on personal matters that were kind in their dishonesty. I'd missed depositions, forgotten to file motions, shown up to court with the wrong case files. My performance had been deteriorating for months, they said, their voices heavy with practiced sympathy. They were right, of course. I'd been somewhere else entirely, my mind grinding through the same loops of memory and regret, while my hands shuffled papers and my mouth formed appropriate sounds. I spent my days in the house after that. The rooms seemed to shift when I wasn't looking at them directly, furniture appearing slightly displaced from where I remembered, as if someone had moved each piece a few inches and then carefully replaced it almost, but not quite, in its original position. I started making marks on the hardwood with chalk, tiny dots at the corners of the couch, the coffee table, the bookshelf. By evening, the marks would be off, the furniture occupying space that didn't align with my careful measurements. Or perhaps my hands had been unsteady. Perhaps my perception was skewed. I'd been drinking more, sleeping less, eating when I remembered to eat. The mirror in the bathroom showed me a face that seemed to belong to someone else, hollow-eyed and gray-skinned, with a strange quality of unfocus that made me think of photographs taken with the wrong exposure settings. The sounds intensified. Footsteps in the hallway while I sat in the kitchen, the distinct creak of the rocking chair in the study. Her chair, the one she'd claimed within a week of moving in, when I was certain I was alone on the first floor. Once, I heard what sounded like humming, a tuneless melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the walls themselves. I searched the house, checking closets and looking under beds like a frightened tenant, finding nothing but dust and the accumulated debris of a shared life that had unraveled. My brother called. I let it go to voicemail. My mother called. I answered that one, managed to approximate normalcy for 12 minutes before claiming another call was coming through and hanging up. Her voice had carried concern, questions forming beneath her casual inquiries about my health, my work, whether I was eating properly. I couldn't explain what was happening because I didn't understand it myself. How could I tell her that I was afraid in my own house, that I felt watched, that sometimes I turned quickly and caught the impression of movement in my peripheral vision, a figure retreating around a corner, dissolving into shadow? The insomnia grew worse. I'd lie awake listening to the house conduct its nocturnal symphony, every sound sharp and significant in the darkness. The scratch of something moving behind the walls, the whisper of air through vents that seemed to carry words just below the threshold of comprehension, the particular quality of silence that feels like held breath, like anticipation, like something waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I started sleeping, or attempting to sleep, during the day. The house felt less aggressive in sunlight, its presence muted by the ordinary sounds of traffic and distant lawnmowers, and the general ambient noise of the world continuing its business outside these walls. But even then, I'd wake from fitful dozes with the conviction that someone had been standing over me, that I'd felt breath on my face or the whisper of fingers through my hair. The figure appeared on a Tuesday afternoon. I'd been sitting in the living room, staring at the television without really seeing it, when movement caught my eye. Someone was standing at the top of the stairs. My heart seized, then began beating so hard I could feel it pulsing in my fingertips. The figure was dark, silhouetted against the window at the landing, and for a long moment we regarded each other across the distance of the stairwell and the width of the living room. Then I blinked, and the space was empty. I told myself it had been a trick of light, a shadow cast by the tree outside, my exhausted brain constructing meaning from meaningless patterns. But my body knew differently. My hands shook as I gripped the armrests, my breath coming shallow and quick, my entire nervous system screaming danger in a language older than words. After that, I saw it regularly, always in peripheral vision, always vanishing when I turned to look directly. A figure that seemed to occupy the edges of my awareness, present in that uncertain space between seeing and imagining. Sometimes it stood in doorways. Sometimes I'd catch its reflection in windows, in mirrors, in the dark screen of the television. It never had a face I could identify, never moved in ways I could definitively categorize as threatening, but its presence felt heavy with significance, with purpose, with a weight that pressed down on my chest and made breathing feel like work. I stopped leaving the house. Groceries could be delivered, bills could be paid online. The world outside these walls felt distant and irrelevant, a place where other people conducted their lives according to rules that no longer applied to me. My entire universe had contracted to these rooms, these walls, this presence that shared the space with me and observed my dissolution with what felt like patient interest. My phone rang less frequently. I stopped checking messages. Time began to feel elastic, hours stretching and compressing in ways that defied the clock on the wall. I'd look up and find that morning had become evening, that I'd lost entire days to the gray fog that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in my skull. The house felt darker, even with all the lights on. The air felt thicker, harder to move through, as if the atmosphere itself had become viscous with something I couldn't name. The figure grew bolder. I'd see it standing at the end of hallways, no longer retreating when I turned to look. It watched me from the shadows of doorways, from the corners of rooms, from the space at the foot of my bed when I lay awake in the deepest hours of night. Its outline was indistinct, shifting, as if it existed slightly out of phase with conventional reality. Sometimes it seemed almost familiar, its proportions suggesting someone I should recognize, someone whose absence had carved a hole in the fabric of my daily existence. But when I tried to focus, tried to make out features or details, my eyes would slide away, unable or unwilling to fix on anything concrete. I began to wonder if she'd ever really left. If perhaps the divorce, the separation, the entire dissolution of our marriage had been something I'd imagined, a story I'd told myself to explain the wrongness that had crept into everything. Maybe she was still here, had always been here, was still moving through these rooms on errands that no longer included me. Maybe I was the one who'd left, who'd retreated into some internal space and simply forgotten to return. The walls held photographs that I didn't remember hanging. The rooms contained furniture that seemed both familiar and alien. My own reflection in mirrors had begun to look like a stranger, someone playing the role of me but getting the details slightly wrong, the performance not quite convincing. I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror one night, studying the face that looked back at me, trying to find something recognizable in those hollowed features. The eyes that met mine seemed to belong to someone else. Someone who'd been living a different life in a different house, with a different set of memories. I raised my hand, and my reflection raised its hand, and there was a delay, infinitesimal, barely perceptible, but present, between my movement and its echo. Or perhaps I imagined it. Perhaps my exhausted mind was constructing meaning from meaningless patterns, seeing significance in random noise, building elaborate narratives from the simple facts of stress and isolation, and a brain chemistry gone slightly awry. The figure stood behind me in the mirror. I could see it reflected over my shoulder, a dark shape that filled the doorway with its presence. My body went rigid, every muscle locked, my breath frozen in my lungs. We stared at each other through the medium of the mirror, me and this thing that had been haunting the edges of my perception for weeks, that had been patient and persistent, and was now making itself undeniably known. I couldn't turn around. Some instinct older than thought kept me frozen in place, kept my eyes fixed on that reflection, that dark figure that stood and watched and waited. If I turned, if I looked at it directly rather than through this intermediate medium, something would change. Something would become real that currently existed in the uncertain space between possibility and confirmation. The figure moved closer. I could see it approaching in the reflection, could see it raising what might have been a hand, reaching toward me, or reaching toward itself, or reaching toward some point in the space between us. The bathroom felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the air growing thick and hard to breathe. My heart hammered against my ribs, my hands gripping the edge of the sink so hard my knuckles had gone white. The figure's hand, if it was a hand, touched the back of my neck. I felt the contact, cold and somehow distant, as if sensation itself had to travel from very far away to reach me. The touch felt familiar. It felt like coming home and like violation, like comfort, and like the most profound wrongness I'd ever experienced. I could see my own face in the mirror, could see the terror written in every line and shadow, could see the way my eyes had gone wide and glassy with fear or madness or something that defied categorization. Behind me, the figure leaned closer, and I still couldn't make out its features, still couldn't determine if it was something that had invaded this space or something that had always been here, waiting for me to deteriorate enough to finally perceive it. My reflection smiled. I wasn't smiling. My face remained locked in its expression of frozen horror while my reflection's mouth curved upward, while something that looked like me, but wasn't me, performed an expression of satisfaction or recognition or welcome. The figure behind me spoke. I heard the sound without hearing it, felt the words more than understood them, a vibration that resonated through my bones and teeth and the soft tissue of my brain. It said something about coming home, about finally being ready, about the long wait ending and the real work beginning. It said things I can't remember and things I'll never forget, and its voice was familiar in a way that made my stomach turn and my skin crawl and every survival instinct scream for me to run. But I couldn't move. I stood there, trapped between the mirror and the thing behind me, between my reflection and my reflection's reflection, between the version of myself I thought I knew and the version that smiled back at me with eyes that had never been mine. The house settled around us, creaking and breathing and holding us in its embrace. Outside, the world continued its business, people living their lives in spaces where the walls stayed where they were supposed to stay, where reflections behaved according to physical laws, where the presence of another could be confirmed through conventional means. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, I was alone in the bathroom. The mirror showed only me, hollow-eyed and gray-skinned, staring at my own reflection with an expression that might have been relief or terror, or the recognition that I could no longer trust what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. The divorce papers were still on the kitchen counter, unsigned. My lawyer had never called. The law firm had never let me go. I checked my phone and found messages from my brother, from my mother, from friends and colleagues, all from earlier today, all expressing normal concerns about normal things in normal language. I looked at the date on my phone. It was still Thursday. The same Thursday I'd woken up to. The same Thursday I'd been living in for what felt like weeks. Time had looped or stopped or never passed at all, and I couldn't determine which explanation was more terrifying. The house creaked. Upstairs, footsteps began their measured climb. I stood in the bathroom doorway and listened to something moving through the space above me. Something that knew I was listening, that wanted me to know it was there. I still don't know if I'm haunted by something that entered these walls, or something that's always lived inside them. I don't know if the figure in the mirror was external, or if I'd been looking at some fractured piece of myself. Some part that had broken away during all those weeks of stress and isolation and the slow dissolution of everything I thought was solid. What I know is this: the house is never empty anymore. What I know is that my reflection sometimes moves before I do. What I know is that I'm still here, still in these rooms, still listening to footsteps on the stairs and trying to remember what day it is and whether I've eaten, and if any of this is real. The figure stands in the doorway now, watching me write this. I can see it in my peripheral vision, patient and persistent, waiting for something I can't name and might not survive understanding. I don't turn to look at it directly. I never turn to look at it directly, because somewhere in the part of my brain that still functions, that still maintains some connection to the person I used to be, I understand that the moment I acknowledge it fully, the moment I meet its eyes and confirm its existence beyond doubt, something will change that can never be changed back. So I sit here, writing these words, feeling its presence like a weight on my chest, like cold fingers on the back of my neck, like breath against my ear. And I wonder if this is how it begins. The final unraveling, the last thread giving way. Or if this is how it's always been, and I'm only now seeing clearly for the first time in my life. The house settles. The figure waits, and I remain suspended in this moment, this endless Thursday, trying to remember what came before, and terrified of what might come after. Story 14. The realtor mentioned it only once, almost as an afterthought, her manicured nail tapping against the contract as she slid it across the mahogany desk. The previous tenants had left rather suddenly, she said. Something about feeling uncomfortable. Nothing structural, nothing wrong with the house itself. Just uncomfortable. She smiled when she said it, the kind of smile that suggested I shouldn't worry, that people were simply too sensitive these days, too quick to imagine problems where none existed. I should have asked more questions. The house stood at the end of Millbrook Lane, a brick colonial with white shutters and a wraparound porch that had probably been charming once. Now it simply looked tired, the paint peeling in long strips like dead skin, the windows reflecting nothing but gray sky even on sunny days. The neighborhood itself was pleasant enough. Old trees lining quiet streets, children's bicycles abandoned on lawns, the distant sound of a dog barking. Normal, safe. Exactly what I needed after the divorce, after the cramped apartment downtown where the walls were thin enough to hear every argument, every life bleeding into mine. The first week passed unremarkably. I unpacked boxes, assembled furniture, learned the house's peculiar vocabulary, the way the pipes groaned when I showered, the creak of the third step from the top, the rattle of the kitchen window when wind came from the east. Every house has its sounds, its idiosyncrasies. I told myself that. I told myself that repeatedly as I lay in bed those first nights, listening to the structure settle around me like an old body easing into rest. It was Mrs. Chen from next door who planted the seed, though I don't think she meant to. She appeared on my porch on the 8th day, bearing a casserole dish wrapped in aluminum foil and an expression of practiced neighborly concern. The conversation meandered through pleasantries about the weather, about her grandchildren who visited on weekends, about the best grocery stores in the area. Then, as she turned to leave, she paused at the edge of the porch steps. The previous family, she mentioned casually, had only stayed 6 months. Nice people, she said, kept to themselves mostly. But they'd seemed increasingly on edge toward the end, jumping at shadows, installing extra locks. She'd heard them arguing late at night, though she couldn't make out the words. Just the tone. Sharp, frightened. They'd left in the middle of their lease, she added, her voice dropping to something conspiratorial. Packed up in a single weekend and disappeared. She shook her head as if the whole thing was a silly mystery, and told me she hoped I'd find the place more agreeable. That night, I became aware of the silence. It pressed against my eardrums like water pressure, thick and absolute. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. I turned on the television, let the voices fill the living room, but even their chatter felt absorbed somehow, muffled by the walls. When I switched it off, the silence rushed back, and within it, I thought I heard something else. A soft susurration, like whispered conversation just below the threshold of comprehension. I stood in the center of the living room, holding my breath, straining to locate the source. Nothing. Just the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the distant rumble of a car passing on the main road. I was being ridiculous. Mrs. Chen's story had gotten into my head, that was all. Suggestion was a powerful thing. I'd read about it in graduate school, how expectation shaped perception, how the mind filled in blanks with whatever it anticipated finding. But the awareness, once triggered, wouldn't fade. I began noticing things, small things. The way shadows pooled in the corners even when I turned on every light. The cold spot near the basement door that my rational mind attributed to poor insulation. The sensation, increasingly persistent, of being watched. Not overtly, not obviously, but in the periphery of consciousness. The way you might sense someone's gaze across a crowded room. I started spending time at the library, researching the house's history under the guise of curiosity, telling myself I was simply being thorough. The record showed nothing remarkable. Built in 1952, owned by a series of unremarkable families. No deaths on the property, no scandals, yet the turnover rate was notable. No one stayed longer than 3 years. Most left within 18 months. The librarian, an elderly man with liver-spotted hands and patient eyes, noticed my interest. When I asked if he knew anything about the property, his expression shifted, not to fear exactly, but to something more cautious. He told me that houses developed reputations, deserved or not, and once they did, people found what they expected to find. A creak became a footstep, a draft became a breath on the back of the neck. The mind was a powerful architect, he said, especially when primed with suggestion. His words should have comforted me. Instead, they highlighted the question I was trying to avoid. Was I imagining things because I'd been told to expect them? Or was there something genuinely wrong? The dream started in the 3rd week. Not nightmares exactly, too subtle for that. Just vivid, hyper-realistic sequences where I'd wake in my bed, certain I was awake, and hear footsteps in the hallway. In the dream, I'd get up to investigate, but the hallway would stretch impossibly long, doors multiplying along its length, each one slightly ajar, darkness pressing through the gaps. I'd try to run back to my room, but my legs would move through air thick as gel, and behind me, the footsteps would continue, steady and unhurried, growing closer. Then I'd actually wake, gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, and the house would be perfectly still, perfectly silent, except for the sense that something had just stopped moving, had just become still the moment my eyes opened. I stopped sleeping well. The exhaustion made everything worse. Sounds seemed louder, shadows deeper. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked haggard, eyes red-rimmed and wild. I was becoming what Mrs. Chen had described, jumpy, paranoid, seeing threats where none existed. I knew it was happening. I could observe my own deterioration with a distant clinical part of my mind that remained rational even as the rest unraveled. Yet knowing didn't help. I began documenting everything, thinking perhaps if I recorded it objectively, I could determine what was real and what was imagined. I noted every unusual sound, every cold spot, every moment of unease. The list grew quickly. 2:17 a.m., sound of cabinet closing in kitchen. 3:43 a.m., footsteps on stairs. 4:15 a.m., sensation of someone standing beside bed. 11:34 p.m., saw movement in upstairs window from yard, except I was alone in the house. Reading back through my notes, I couldn't determine if I'd documented genuine phenomena or merely cataloged my own descent into obsession. The house had become a mirror, reflecting my expectations back at me with perfect fidelity. Or perhaps I'd become a mirror for the house, finally sensitive enough to perceive what had always been there. The turning point came on a Tuesday night. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, my 5th cup of the day, trying to stay alert, when I heard it clearly. Not the usual ambiguous creaks and groans, but distinct footsteps crossing the floor above me. The ceiling boards flexed slightly with the weight. Left to right, bedroom to bathroom, the precise route I walked every morning. I grabbed a flashlight and went upstairs, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. The hallway was empty. Every room was empty. I checked closets, looked under beds, confirmed all windows were locked. Nothing. No one. But when I returned downstairs, I found the kitchen cabinet doors standing open. All of them. Every single one. Like a mouthful of dark tongues. I'd closed them before going up. I was certain I had. The certainty felt absolute, carved into my memory with crystal clarity. Unless I hadn't. Unless the stress, the sleeplessness, the constant vigilance had fractured my perception so thoroughly that I could no longer trust even immediate memory. Unless Mrs. Chen's casual story, the librarian's warnings, the house's reputation had so thoroughly colonized my mind that I was essentially haunting myself. That night, I packed a bag and drove to a hotel. The distance should have helped. I should have felt relief, safety, the freedom of neutral space. Instead, I lay in the generic hotel bed, staring at the textured ceiling, and felt unmoored. The house had become my fixed point, my obsession, and without it, I felt incomplete. I'd left something undone, something unresolved. The not knowing gnawed at me worse than the fear ever had. Around 3 a.m, I got back in my car. The house was dark when I arrived, darker somehow than the surrounding night, as if it absorbed light rather than merely blocking it. I stood on the lawn for a long time, looking up at the windows, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw a face looking back from the bedroom. My bedroom, the room that should have been empty, but when I blinked, there was nothing. Just glass reflecting streetlight, ordinary and inert. I went inside. The air felt different, charged somehow, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. I moved through the rooms slowly, flashlight beam cutting through darkness that seemed almost solid. Every object was exactly where I'd left it. Nothing had been disturbed. Yet the house felt occupied, inhabited by some presence that wasn't quite physical but wasn't quite imaginary either. In the living room, I found my notebook, the one where I'd been documenting everything, open on the coffee table. I didn't remember leaving it there. I remembered putting it in my bag, taking it to the hotel, but here it was, open to a blank page. Except it wasn't entirely blank. Someone had written a single word in handwriting that looked disturbingly like my own. Listening, I stood there for a long time, flashlight trained on that word, trying to remember if I'd written it myself, if this was another gap in my memory, another fracture in my certainty. The harder I tried to remember, the less sure I became. The possibility that I'd written it and forgotten felt as plausible as the alternative, that something else had. That's when I understood the real horror. Not that the house might be haunted, not that something supernatural might be occurring, but that I would never know. The seed planted by Mrs. Chen's story, cultivated by the librarian's warnings and the house's reputation, had grown so thoroughly through my perception that I could no longer distinguish between genuine phenomena and expectation fulfilled. Every creak could be settling wood or footsteps. Every cold spot could be a draft or a presence. Every shadow could be empty space or watching darkness. I'd become my own haunting, indistinguishable from any external force. The question that keeps me awake, and I don't sleep much anymore, is whether it matters. If I can't tell the difference between a house that's genuinely wrong and my own contaminated perception, does the distinction hold meaning? The fear is identical. The effect is identical. I jump at the same sounds, feel the same eyes on my back. experience the same certainty that I'm not alone. I still live here. I'm not sure why. Maybe because leaving would be an admission that I've lost my grip on reality. Maybe because staying is an admission of the same thing. Maybe because part of me, the part that lies awake listening to the house breathe around me, wants to know the truth with desperate, irrational hunger. Last night I woke to find myself standing in the hallway with no memory of getting out of bed. The basement door stood open at the far end, darkness yawning up from below. I don't remember opening it, but I also don't remember walking to the hallway, and yet here I was, sleepwalking or summoned or simply mad. I approached the open door, drawn by the same compulsion that keeps me in this house, and from the basement I heard it clearly. Breathing, not my own. Someone else's, or something else's, or the sound of my own breath echoing back from the concrete walls below, transformed by expectation into something other. I stood at the threshold for a long time, flashlight aimed down into darkness that seemed to writhe just beyond the beam's reach. Every instinct screamed at me to close the door, to run, to leave this house and never return. But another part of me, growing stronger each day, needed to know. Needed to descend those stairs and confront whatever waited below, even if what waited was nothing more than my own fractured reflection. The breathing continued, steady and patient. And I realized, with a clarity that felt almost like peace, that I would never know if it was real. The house had taught me that, or I had taught myself that, using the house as excuse and instrument. We'd become inseparable now, the house and I, locked in a relationship where perception and reality had merged so completely that the distinction had become meaningless. I closed the door, or maybe it closed itself. I'm not sure anymore. I'm not sure of anything anymore, except that I'm listening, always listening, and so is the house. We're listening to each other, waiting to see who breaks first.